Hey there and welcome back. If you are already settled, the lamp turned low, the room gone quiet around you, then you are exactly where you need to be. Because tonight is for anyone who has ever loved someone they could not quite read. Someone who never said the thing you needed to hear. Who gave you their presence but withheld their heart, so that you spent years trying to work out, from the smallest signs, whether you were loved at all. We live now in an age that asks people to say everything, to name every feeling the moment it arrives. The world we are going into tonight did the opposite. It was a place of restraint, of things left unspoken on purpose, of marriages arranged like treaties between great houses where a husband and a wife might share a name and a bed and 3 children and 30 years, and still never once tell each other plainly what they felt. And there, in the candle-lit drawing rooms of Georgian England, there was one marriage that everyone watched and no one understood. A marriage between the most worshipped woman in the kingdom and the most silent man in it. They were married for 32 years, and at the very end, when it was almost over, the question that had hung over the whole of it was still unanswered. Was it a love story, or was it not? Before we go any further into their lives, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, whether it is early evening and the light is only just going, or the deep middle of the night, and you are the only one awake in the house. These quiet hours, the ones we are about to spend together, were the hours that mattered most to the 2 people at the heart of tonight's story, because the daylight hours belonged to everyone else, to the crowds and the politics and the watching crowd, and only the late ones were truly theirs. If you find a place in these journeys through the past, the kind of place where the present loosens its grip for a while, then do consider subscribing so the next one finds its way to you. I read the messages people leave, the cities and the small hours they write to me from, and it is one of the quiet pleasures of doing this. So tell me where you are, and then let us go back. Picture this. It is the 7th of June in the year 1774, and it is a girl's 17th birthday. The place is Wimbledon, on the southern edge of London, where the Spencer family, one of the wealthiest families in England, keep a house among the green parkland. It is early summer, and the light through the tall windows is the long gold light of a June morning in the south of England. The girl whose birthday it is has been awake since early, dressed by maids who have been trembling slightly with the importance of the day, because this is not only her birthday, it is also by a decision taken to avoid the crush and spectacle of a fashionable society wedding, with the date itself quietly brought forward and the guests cut down to nearly no one, the morning of her marriage. She is 17 years old today, and today she will become a Duchess. Her name is Georgiana Spencer. By tonight it will be Georgiana Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire, and from this morning forward, for the rest of her short and brilliant life, she will be the most famous woman in England. You would have liked her. That is the thing to understand first, before anything else. Almost everyone who met Georgiana Spencer liked her, and most of them loved her, and a remarkable number of them went on loving her for the whole of their lives. She had been raised at Althorpe, the Spencer house in Northamptonshire, in a family that was, by the standards of the 18th century aristocracy, startlingly warm. Her mother adored her. Her father loved her. She had grown up surrounded by affection given freely and openly, told constantly that she was charming and clever and delightful, and she had become, as such children do, a person who radiated affection and expected it back. She lit up rooms. She remembered names. She made the shy feel clever and the dull feel interesting. She had, even at 17, that rare and slightly dangerous gift of making whoever she was speaking to feel, for the length of the conversation, like the only person in the room. And she was about to marry a man who had almost none of these qualities at all. He was waiting for her that June morning somewhere in the house. We do not know exactly where or what he was doing or what he was thinking, and that absence is the first true thing about him. William Cavendish, 5th Duke of Devonshire, was 25 years old. He was tall and well-made, with a heavy, handsome, rather immobile face, and he carried himself with the unhurried assurance of a man who had never in his life had to wonder whether he mattered. He was one of the richest men in the kingdom, the head of one of its oldest and grandest families, and he was, by the near universal account of everyone who ever tried to describe him, almost impossible to know. He spoke little, he showed less. He was not cruel, and he was not stupid. Though people sometimes mistook his silence for one or the other, he simply gave nothing away. Where Georgiana was all surface warmth and quick feeling, the Duke was a closed room with the curtains drawn, and the marriage that was about to take place between them, this union of the warmest woman in England and one of its coldest men, had not been arranged by either of them. It had been arranged, as these things were, by their families, who saw in it the joining of two great fortunes and two great names, and who did not pause for very long over the question of whether the two people involved were suited to one another. They were suitable. That was the word that mattered. Suitable was not the same as suited, and the difference between those two words would take 3 decades to play out. I want you to hold for a moment the strangeness of what she was walking into, because it is easy, from where we sit, to forget how little she knew. She was 17. She had met the Duke only a handful of times. The courtship, such as it was, had been brief and conducted largely through the parents. She had been told that he was a great match, the greatest in England, and this was true. She had been told that she was fortunate, and by every external measure she was. What she had not been told, because nobody quite knew how to say it, and because she would not have understood it if they had, was that the man she was marrying was constitutionally unable to give her the one thing she had been raised to need above all others. She needed to be loved out loud. She needed it the way other people need air. And she was binding herself, that bright June morning, for life, and without possibility of release, to a man who would spend the next 32 years loving her, if he loved her at all, in a language she could not hear. The ceremony itself was small. This was deliberate. A wedding between the Devonshires and the Spencers could have filled a London church with half the peerage, but the families had chosen instead a quiet service, and so it was done at Wimbledon, among family, on her birthday, without crowds. She wore the clothes of a bride of her rank, rich and pale and heavy with the work of a dozen hands. The vows were exchanged in the form the church laid down, the same words that bound every couple in England, duke and labourer alike, to have and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death them did part. She would have spoken her part in that clear, carrying, charming voice that everyone remarked on. He would have spoken his in the low, level, unreadable tone that gave nothing away. And then it was done. The richest bachelor in England was married. The most charming girl in England was a Duchess at 17, and the longest unanswered question of her life had just been asked. Who he was, this man she had married, she did not yet know, and her not knowing was the engine of everything that followed. To understand the marriage, you have to understand him first, and to understand him we have to go back, before this wedding, before she ever entered his life, to a great house in Derbyshire, and a boy who was handed the weight of the world before he was old enough to carry it. To find the beginning of William Cavendish, you have to go to Derbyshire, to a valley in the Peak District, where a river called the Derwent runs between green hills, and to the house that stands beside it. Chatsworth. Even now it is one of the great houses of England, a palace in everything but name, its long golden front of windows facing across formal water and rising parkland to the moors beyond. In the middle of the 18th century it was already old, already grand, already the visible expression of a family that had been accumulating land and influence and marriages for 200 years. The Cavendishes were not new money pretending to be old. They were the article itself. They had been earls, then dukes. They had helped to put kings on the throne and take them off again. They owned vast tracts of Derbyshire and Yorkshire and Ireland, whole towns, whole valleys, the mineral rights under the hills and the rents of the farms in the dales. And into this inheritance, on a December day in 1748, a boy was born who would one day hold all of it. He was the eldest son, which meant that from the hour of his birth his life was, in a sense, already written. He would be the Duke. Everything that happened to him before, that was preparation for it, and everyone around him understood this, and so, very early, did he. His father was William Cavendish, 4th Duke of Devonshire, a serious and capable man who would briefly hold the highest office in the land. For a few months over 1756 and 1757, in one of those tangled ministries that the politics of the age threw up, the 4th Duke served as First Lord of the Treasury, which is to say, as the head of the government of Great Britain. He did not seek the post, and did not enjoy it, and he gave it up without regret, but the fact of it sat in the family like a piece of the plate. The boy grew up the son of a man who had run the country. That does something to a child, even a child who is told nothing directly. It settles into him as a sense of where he stands in the order of things, which is to say, very near the top, with no one much above him and almost everyone below. His mother was Charlotte Boyle, and she brought into the marriage an inheritance almost as dazzling as the one she married into. She was the daughter and heiress of the 3rd Earl of Burlington, the most famous patron of architecture in England, the man who had brought the cool, clean lines of Italian Palladian building back across the Channel and reshaped the taste of a nation around them. Through her came Chiswick, Burlington's exquisite villa on the western edge of London, a building so perfect in its proportions that architects still travel to study it. Through her came estates in Yorkshire and in Ireland, the Boyle lands and the Clifford barony, folded now into the already enormous Cavendish holdings. She was, by the accounts that survive, intelligent and lively, and she died when her eldest son was only 5 or 6 years old, in 1754, leaving him with a mother he could barely remember, and a father who was occupied with the affairs of a kingdom. So the first thing to understand about the man Georgiana married is that he had lost his mother as a small child and would lose his father as a boy. The 4th Duke's health failed in the early 1760s. He went abroad to the spa town of Spa itself in the Austrian Netherlands in search of a cure that the waters could not give him, and there, in 1764, he died. He was 44. His eldest son was 15. Hold that number for a moment, because it explains a great deal of what came after. At an age when most boys are still half-formed, still being corrected and shaped and told what to do, William Cavendish became one of the half-dozen richest men in the kingdom, and the head of a family that ranked with royalty. There was no father now to defer to, no mother to soften the household, no one above him in his own house. He had guardians and trustees and lawyers who managed the estates through the years of his legal minority, but the deference of servant and steward, tenant and tutor was already bending toward him as the master to come. He was a duke in waiting from the age of 15, and then, at 21, a duke in full. You do not learn tenderness in that position. You learn the opposite. You learn that the world arranges itself around you whether you ask it to or not, that people watch your face for instructions, that you need never raise your voice because the room is already listening. You learn to give nothing away, because everything you give away will be noticed and weighed and repeated. The reserve that everyone found so baffling in the grown duke was not, I think, a coldness he was born with. It was a thing the position built into him, year by year, from the time he was a motherless, fatherless boy alone at the top of an enormous house. By the time he came of age, he had settled into the shape he would keep for the rest of his life. He was a man of fixed habits and few words. He liked the things that asked nothing emotional of him. He liked his dogs and kept them about him, and was easier in their company, some said, than in the company of people. He liked cards, and would sit for hours at the tables at Brooks's, the gentlemen's club in St. James's, where the Whig aristocracy gambled and drank and ran the unofficial business of their party, and there he was a fixture, calm and unhurried, neither winning nor losing with any visible emotion. He liked his wine, in the steady, unremarkable quantities of his class and time. He liked routine above almost everything, the same hours, the same pursuits, the same untroubled passage of the days. He was not a fool. Those who got past the silence found a dry intelligence underneath, and a fund of sound, unshowy judgment. But he was, by temperament and by training, a man who lived behind glass. You could see him perfectly well. You simply could not get in. In the politics of his age he was a Whig, as the Cavendishes had always been, and a man of weight in his party, less for anything he said than for what he was. He controlled seats in Parliament. He commanded the loyalty of a great following. His house in London, Devonshire House, would become the gathering place of the Whig leadership, the headquarters in all but name of the party of Charles James Fox. But the Duke himself was no orator and no schemer. He lent the cause his name, his money, and his roof, and let louder men do the talking. This too was of a piece with the rest of him. He was a foundation, not a flame. He held things up. He did not light them. This was the man, then, who stood waiting in the house at Wimbledon on a June morning in 1774 for a girl of 17 to be brought to him, 25 years old, master of half of Derbyshire, owner of palaces, head of one of the first families of the realm, and sealed shut as tightly as any man in England. He had agreed to the marriage because it was suitable, because the Spencers were a great family, and the girl was charming and well-connected, and would do credit to his name, and in time give him an heir. Whether he felt anything beyond that, anything like hope or tenderness or even curiosity, we cannot say, because he did not say, then or ever. And that is the cruelty hidden inside the bright morning of the wedding. She was marrying a man she could not read. He was marrying a girl who needed, above all things, to be read. Neither of them knew yet how completely those two facts would define the years ahead. But we know. And so, as the wedding party disperses and the new Duchess of Devonshire steps for the first time into her husband's domain, the first thing she must learn is the place itself, the vast grand houses that were now hers to preside over, and in which the whole of this long marriage would be lived. Let us go there first, to the two great houses between which her life would swing for the next 3 decades. To understand a marriage, you have to understand the rooms it was lived in, and Georgiana's marriage was lived in some of the grandest rooms in England. There were two houses above all, and between them the rhythm of her married life swung back and forth for 32 years like a slow pendulum. There was Devonshire House in London, the town palace behind its high wall in Piccadilly, where the social and political seasons were passed. And there was Chatsworth, far to the north in Derbyshire, the principal country seat among the hills, where the family withdrew when London emptied and the year turned toward autumn and winter. To be Duchess of Devonshire was to live between these two poles, the city and the country, the crowd and the quiet, and to carry the whole apparatus of a great household back and forth along the roads of England as the seasons dictated. Chatsworth was the heart of the Cavendish power, the seat from which the family took its consequence, and it was a place built to overwhelm. The house sat in a valley with the moors rising behind it, its long front of windows looking out over formal gardens and rushing water to the green parkland beyond. It had been built and rebuilt through generations into a palace of staterooms and galleries and painted ceilings, hung with the accumulated treasures of 200 years of wealth and acquisition. There were halls a visitor could lose himself in, staircases of carved stone, a broad cascade of water falling down the hillside in stepped channels, gardens laid out to impress and parkland that ran for miles. To arrive there, up the long approach with the house unfolding before you, was to be reminded of exactly how large the family was that Georgiana had married into, how old, how rich, how rooted in the land. She had come from a great family herself, but the Cavendishes were a power, and Chatsworth was the visible proof of it, the stone declaration of what her husband was. Devonshire House in London was grand in a different and more guarded way. From the street it gave little away, a plain front and a high wall, the splendour kept inside and hidden from the common gaze. But within those walls it was a palace too, its staterooms hung with crimson and gold, its great staircase sweeping up through the heart of the building, its walls dense with the family portraits that watched over every gathering. And it was, under Georgiana, far more than a private residence. It became the unofficial headquarters of the Whig party, the place where the political opposition gathered, planned, dined and conspired, the social centre of a whole faction of the English aristocracy. To be received at Devonshire House was to be admitted to the inner circle of fashionable and political London, and the woman who presided over it, who set its tone and gathered its company and made it the place everyone wished to be, was Georgiana herself. If Chatsworth was her husband's power made visible, Devonshire House was, in large part, her own. The movement between the two houses gave the marriage its shape, and it is worth feeling the texture of it. In the London season, from the early spring into the summer, the family was in town, and Georgiana's days were the whirl of society, the balls and the assemblies and the late nights, the politics and the crowds, the relentless public performance of being the most famous woman in England. Then, as the season closed and the fashionable world scattered, the family removed to the country, to Chatsworth, to the slower rhythm of country life, the long quiet days, the visits, the shooting in season, the great house full of guests through the autumn. The Duke, by temperament, was happier in the country, among his routines and his dogs and the management of his estates. Georgiana, by temperament, was a creature of the town, of the lights and the company and the stimulation she could never quite get enough of. Even in the geography of their lives, the mismatch told. He drew toward the quiet north. She lit up in the southern blaze. They met in the middle, season after season, two people whose natures pulled in opposite directions, bound to make a single life between them in the houses they shared. There were other houses too, the accumulated property of an enormous inheritance. There was Chiswick, the exquisite villa on the western edge of London that had come into the family through the Duke's mother, a jewel of a place where smaller gatherings were held and where in time much of the family's more intimate life would be passed. There were estates in Yorkshire, in Ireland, the great holding of land and rents and mineral wealth that funded the whole magnificent machine. But it was Chatsworth and Devonshire House, the country seat and the town palace, that were the true stage of the marriage, the rooms in which the long drama of Georgiana and her Duke was played out. It was in these rooms that the warmth met the silence, that the unusual household of three assembled itself, that the children were born and the secrets kept and the scandals weathered and the reconciliations made. Everything we are going to follow happened here, in these grand and watchful spaces behind these walls. So picture her, the new young Duchess, learning her way through these enormous houses in the first months of her marriage, mistress of more rooms than she could keep in her head, of more servants than she could name, of a position and a splendour that would have turned a steadier head than hers. She was 17, and all of it was suddenly hers to preside over, and somewhere within it moved the silent husband whose world this truly was. The grandeur was real, and it was hers, and it could not fill the particular emptiness she had carried into it from her wedding day. We turn now to those first months, and to what it was to be young and adored by everyone except the one person whose devotion she had married to win. Imagine the first weeks of being a duchess at 17. You have left your father's house where you were the bright centre of an affectionate family, where feeling was spoken aloud and affection came at you from every side, and you have arrived in the great silent palaces that are now your home, mistress of more rooms and more servants than you can hold in your head, presiding over a magnificence that would turn a steadier head than yours, and somewhere within all that grandeur moves your husband, going about his fixed and private days, as much a stranger to you as the painted ceilings and the 200-year-old faces watching from the walls. The splendour is real. It is yours, and it does nothing at all for the particular loneliness you carried in through the door. The mismatch announced itself almost at once, and it announced itself in the texture of ordinary life. Georgiana woke to a household she did not understand, and a husband who would not explain it. She was used to talk, to the easy current of family conversation, to a house where feelings were spoken and laughter came readily. The Duke's house ran on something close to silence. He rose. He dealt with whatever the day required. He went to his club. He returned. He dined. He played cards. He went to bed. He was unfailingly correct with her. He was never unkind. But he did not confide in her, did not seek her company for its own sake, did not appear to need from her any of the things she was bursting to give. She had married, she discovered, a man who was complete without her. And for a girl raised to believe that her warmth was her great gift to the world, there could have been no lonelier discovery than to find that the one person now bound to her did not seem to want it. There were the dogs. For one thing, the Duke kept dogs about him constantly and was demonstrably fonder of them than of most human company. A new bride, hoping to be the chief object of her husband's attention, found herself in a household where the spaniels had a more secure place in his affections than she did, and were certainly easier in his presence. It became, in time, a kind of family joke, repeated with the rueful humour that Georgiana used to dress her real disappointments, that the Duke loved his dogs best. But behind the joke was a young woman lying awake in an unfamiliar palace, working out that the man she had married was going to give her courtesy and consequence and a great position, and was not going to give her himself. And yet it would be wrong to paint these months as simple misery, because Georgiana was not built for misery. and the place she had entered offered her, almost immediately, an enormous compensation. If her husband would not adore her, London would. The young Duchess of Devonshire stepped into society in the autumn and winter of 1774, and society fell at her feet. She was 17. She was titled. She was rich beyond reckoning. She was pretty in a fresh, animated, irresistible way. And she had that gift, the gift of warmth, that no amount of money can buy and no rank can confer. People wanted to be near her. They copied what she wore. They repeated what she said. Within a single season, she was the acknowledged leader of fashionable London, the figure every hostess wanted at her table, and every young woman wanted to imitate. The adoration her husband withheld came pouring in from every other direction, and Georgiana, who needed it as she needed air, drank it down. This is one of the patterns of her life, established right here at the start, and worth naming clearly, because it will return again and again. The love she could not get at home she sought outside it, not at first in any scandalous sense, but in the sheer volume of attention she gathered around herself, the crowds, the admirers, the parties that ran till dawn, the constant emotion and noise and applause. A different woman, married to a silent man, might have turned inward and shrunk. Georgiana turned outward and expanded until she filled the whole of fashionable England. She became famous, genuinely famous, in a way that was almost new in the world, a private person known by sight to thousands who had never met her, her face on prints in shop windows, her hats and her hairstyles imitated up and down the country. She invented more or less the role of the celebrity aristocrat, the great lady who is watched not for what she does but for what she is. And she did it, at least in part, to fill a hole that had opened on her wedding day. The Duke watched all this with his usual unreadable composure. It seems not to have troubled him. A husband of a different temperament might have resented a wife who outshone him so completely, who drew every eye in every room while he stood like furniture at the edge of it. The Duke did not appear to mind. Some read this as a further proof of his coldness, evidence that he did not care enough about her to be jealous. But there is another reading, and it is worth holding alongside the first, because the whole of this story turns on the difficulty of reading him. It may be that he was simply secure, too grand and too self-contained to feel diminished by his wife's splendour, content to let her shine and to be the steady ground she shone from. We cannot know. That is the maddening thing about him, the thing Georgiana would spend 3 decades up against. Every act of his could be read 2 ways, as indifference or as a love too deep and too buried to show itself, and he never gave the clue that would settle it. What we can say is that the early marriage settled into a working arrangement that suited him and starved her. He had his routines and his clubs and his dogs and his untroubled days. She had her triumphs in society, her crowds, her growing fame. They met at the points society required them to meet, at the great dinners and the public occasions, the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire side by side, the most dazzling couple in England, while inside the marriage there was a coolness that the glitter hid. He had his world, in other words, and she had hers, and the two touched only where the season and the family obliged them to touch. And his world, the one he withdrew into when he left her among her crowds, is worth following closely, because the shape of his days reveals the shape of the marriage more plainly than anything he ever said. Let us follow him there, into the rooms where he was most himself. That sphere was, above all, the clubs, and of one club in particular, Brooks's in St. James's, the great gathering place of the Whig aristocracy, where the men of his party drank and dined and gambled and conducted over the card tables and the wine, the unofficial business of political England. Here the Duke was a fixture. Here, more than anywhere, he was at his ease. Brooks's was a man's world, closed to wives, a refuge from the demands of society and the household, and the Duke spent a great part of his life inside it. He would sit at the tables for hours, playing the deep games that the men of his class played for stakes that could ruin lesser fortunes, and he played as he did everything, without visible emotion, neither elated by winning nor cast down by losing, a calm, immovable presence among the noise. He drank in the steady manner of his kind. He talked little, but he listened, and his presence carried weight, because he was who he was, the head of one of the first families of the realm, the owner of the roof under which the party gathered. He did not need to be brilliant. He needed only to be there, solid and reliable and grand. And he was. There is a particular irony in the Duke's relationship with gambling that is worth pausing on, because it sat at the very centre of the marriage's troubles, and he seems never to have felt its weight. He gambled, as all his class gambled, and he could afford to. His fortune was so vast that the losses of an evening, however large, were nothing to him, a few ripples on a deep sea. He played for amusement and walked away untroubled. His wife gambled too, with the same passion and the same recklessness, but she could not afford it because the money was not hers, and what was a diversion for him became, for her, a slow catastrophe of secret debt. The same activity, pursued by husband and wife in the same circle, meant freedom for one and ruin for the other, and the difference was simply power, the power that he held and she did not. He could lose a fortune at Brooks's and feel nothing. She could lose a far smaller sum and lie awake for years in terror of his finding out. Nothing illustrates the asymmetry of the marriage more exactly than this, that they shared a vice and that it cost them so unequally. The clubs were also where the Duke discharged his political existence, such as it was, and his political existence was almost entirely a matter of being rather than doing. He was a Whig grandee, a man whose support a politician wanted not for his eloquence, of which he had none, but for his name, his money, his following, and the great house he placed at the party's disposal. He sat in the House of Lords, and rarely troubled it with a speech. He controlled, through the old electoral arrangements of the unreformed system, seats in the House of Commons, which he could bestow on the rising men of his choosing. He lent the cause his weight and his roof, and let the loud men, the orators and the schemers, the Foxes and the Sheridans, do the work of talk and intrigue. In the political world, as in everything, the Duke was a foundation and not a flame, a thing that held others up and never itself burned. What this meant for Georgiana day to day was absence. Her husband was a great deal away from her, at his club, at his cards, in the world of men where she could not follow, or in the country among his estates and his dogs and his routines. The marriage was built, structurally, around his withdrawal. He gave her his name and his houses and his consequence, and a son in the end, and the rest of the time he was, in large part, elsewhere, leading the parallel life of a man of his class, who found the company of the card-room easier than the company of his own wife. It was not cruelty. It was simply the shape of the thing, the ordinary arrangement of a marriage in which the husband had his world and the wife had hers, and the two touched only at the points the season and the family required. But for a woman who needed, above all, to be the centre of someone's attention, a husband who preferred his club was one more confirmation of the loneliness at the heart of her splendid life. And so the daily texture of the marriage, in these early years, was this: he at Brooks's among the men and the cards, calm and untroubled and giving nothing away; she in the wider society, gathering the worship of crowds to fill the place at home that stood empty. Two people sharing a name and a roof and almost nothing else, each leading a life the other was hardly part of, meeting at the great occasions and the necessary moments, and then drawing apart again into their separate spheres. It was into this arrangement, this marriage of two parallel lives that barely intersected, that the pressure of the dynasty now pressed, demanding the one thing that required the husband and the wife to be, for a time at least, truly together. And here, we turn now to that demand, and to the years of failure and grief that the meeting it required brought down upon her. And there is a particular loneliness in being wanted for one thing above all others, and then failing, year after year, to provide it. Georgiana entered her marriage with one inescapable function written into the contract of it, a function understood by everyone, spoken of by no one in her hearing, and impossible to escape. She was to give the Duke a son. The whole vast machinery of the Cavendish inheritance, the estates and the titles and the political following, ran on the assumption of a male heir to receive it. A duke without a son was a duke with a problem, and the resolving of that problem was the wife's work and the wife's alone. Georgiana knew this from the day she married, and for years the one thing she most needed to do, she could not do. The life she lived in made the failure public in a way we would find unendurable. A duchess's body was not her own. Her health, her cycles, the state of her marriage in its most private aspect were matters of family concern, and, beyond the family, of national interest. When she conceived, the news travelled. When she lost the child, that news travelled too. There was no privacy in it, no quiet space to grieve a pregnancy that ended, because the pregnancy had never been private to begin with. The whole interested world was watching the Duchess of Devonshire's waistline, and the whole interested public knew, season after season, that there was still no heir. She conceived, and she miscarried more than once. The pattern repeated itself through the early years of the marriage with a cruelty that is hard to read about even now. A pregnancy would begin, and with it the hope and the careful management, the resting and the dosing, and the anxious attention of the doctors, and then it would end before its time, and the hope would collapse, and she would be left to recover her health and her spirits, and begin again. Each loss was a private grief dressed up as a public disappointment. Each one renewed the unspoken question that hung over her marriage. And each one, we may imagine, deepened the distance between her and the husband she could not reach, because here was a sorrow she could not share with him, the one person who had as much at stake in it as she did, and who met it, as he met everything, with a composure that gave her nothing to hold on to. We do not have the Duke's words on any of this, because the Duke left almost no words on anything. We do not know whether he comforted her, or whether he treated the failures as failures, or whether behind the immobile face there was disappointment, or tenderness, or simply the patient expectation of a man who assumed the matter would resolve itself in the end. Georgiana's letters, by contrast, pour out the anguish of it, mostly to her mother, to whom she confided everything. To read them is to watch a young woman blaming herself for something entirely outside her control, casting about for what she might be doing wrong, promising to do better, to be more careful, to follow every instruction, as though the loss of a child were a fault of conduct she could correct with enough effort. It was not, but the age gave her no other way to understand it, and the marriage gave her no one to share it with, and so she carried it largely alone, behind the bright public face that all of London cherished. It is worth pausing here on the particular bind that the dynastic system put her in, because it shaped everything about how she saw herself. In a marriage of affection, a couple who long for a child and struggle to have one at least struggle together, two people facing a private sorrow as one. Georgiana had no such partnership. She had a contract and a duty, a husband who would not open to her, and a society that judged her by results. Her value, in the cold arithmetic of the thing, was contingent. She was the Duchess of Devonshire, the most celebrated woman in England, the leader of fashion and the toast of society. And underneath all of it, she was a young wife who had not yet done the one thing she was for, and who knew that until she did it, her place was not entirely secure. That insecurity, never spoken but always present, is part of what drove her out into the world to be loved by everyone. If she could not be sure of her footing at home, she could at least be certain of her welcome everywhere else. The years passed in this manner, the public brilliance and the private failures running side by side, and as they passed, something else began to take shape in the household, almost in answer to the children Georgiana could not yet bear. The Duke, it transpired, already had a child. Before his marriage he had fathered a daughter on a woman who was not his wife, a little girl with no claim on his name and no secure place in society. What was to be done with such a child was, in that age and in that class, a question with several possible answers, most of them cold. The answer that was arrived at in the Devonshire household tells us something important, not about the Duke, who remained as unreadable as ever, but about the Duchess, because it was Georgiana, the wife who had not yet been able to give him a legitimate heir, who took the Duke's illegitimate daughter into the family and raised her as her own. And in that act, in the way she opened her arms to a child who was in one sense a living reminder of everything that was wrong in her marriage, we see the thing that was truly remarkable in her. Let us look at it closely, because it is one of the keys to her whole nature. The child's name was Charlotte Williams. She had been born to the Duke before his marriage. Her mother, a woman of no rank, whose place in his life had been brief and is now almost entirely lost to us. When the woman died, the little girl was left with nowhere to belong, a duke's daughter with no right to call herself one, the kind of child who in that century was often quietly disposed of into a distant household and a modest allowance, kept at the edge of the family's awareness and out of its sight. That is not what happened to Charlotte Williams. What happened to her was Georgiana. Picture the situation from the Duchess's side. She is young. She is married to a man who keeps her at arm's length. She has been trying and failing to bear a child of her own, and she is told that her husband has a daughter from before the marriage who needs a home. A wife with a harder heart, or a more wounded one, might have wanted nothing to do with the girl, might have seen in her only an insult, a reminder that the Duke had been a father before she could make him one, that the small living evidence of his private life beyond her reach. Georgiana saw a child who needed loving, and loving children was the thing she did better than almost anyone alive. She brought Charlotte Williams into the household and set about being, in every way that mattered, the girl's mother. It was not an entirely easy relationship, and it would be sentimental to pretend it was. Charlotte was not a straightforward child, and her position in the house was an awkward one, neither servant nor true daughter, a girl whose very existence had to be explained in careful terms to a censorious world. Georgiana's letters about her are not all tenderness. There is impatience in them sometimes, the ordinary friction of raising a child who is not easy. But the essential fact stands, and it is a generous one. The Duchess of Devonshire, denied children of her own, gave her care and her protection, and a place at her own hearth to a little girl who had every reason to be unwelcome in it. She educated her. She worried about her. She secured her future, and she did all this for the daughter of a husband who would not give her the affection she craved, which makes the generosity larger, not smaller, because there was nothing in it for her. No reciprocated affection, no gratitude she could count on, only the doing of a kind thing because a child was in need of it. I want to dwell on this, because it cuts against the picture that history has sometimes painted of Georgiana, the picture of the giddy society beauty, the gambler, the fashion plate, the woman who lived for pleasure and applause. All of that was real, but underneath it was a person of deep and reliable kindness, whose first instinct, faced with someone in trouble, was to help, and whose particular genius was for love. She loved easily, widely, and without much calculation. It got her into trouble more than once, as we will see. But it was also the best thing about her, the quality that made the people around her adore her and go on adoring her through every scandal and every disappointment. The taking in of Charlotte Williams is the first clear instance of it in the marriage, and it sets the pattern for what follows. Georgiana would spend her life gathering people to her and caring for them, the legitimate and the illegitimate, the deserving and the difficult, her own children and other women's, with a generosity that did not stop to ask whether the object was strictly hers to love. The arrangement also tells us something about the household itself, about the peculiar elasticity of the great aristocratic family of the period. We tend to imagine these families as rigid, governed by iron rules of legitimacy and inheritance, and in matters of property they were. But in matters of the household, of who lived under the roof and was fed and clothed and counted among the dependents, there was often a surprising looseness. Illegitimate children, poor relations, wards, companions, the children of friends in difficulty, all of these might be absorbed into a great house and raised alongside the true-born sons and daughters, their exact status understood by all, but rarely allowed to disrupt the daily texture of family life. Devonshire House, under Georgiana, would become an unusually capacious version of this, a household that expanded over the years to include children of several different parentages, some of them with origins that the family preferred not to discuss. Charlotte Williams was the first of them. She would not be the last. And the woman at the centre of this widening circle, drawing them all in, mothering them all, was the Duchess who had not yet managed to bear a child of her own. How the Duke regarded his wife's adoption of his natural daughter, we do not know. It would have spared him an awkwardness, certainly, to have the matter handled so gracefully and so kindly by his wife. Whether he felt anything warmer than relief, whether it moved him to see Georgiana take the child to her heart, he did not say. Perhaps it touched him. Perhaps it registered as no more than a domestic convenience. We are back, as we always are with him, in the territory of guesswork, reading a blank face for feelings that may or may not have been there. But Georgiana did not take in Charlotte Williams to move her husband. She did it because the child needed it, and because it was in her nature, and because loving was what she had instead of the thing she had been denied. Before we follow her into the friendship that would reshape her life, though, it is worth pausing on the woman herself, on what she was made of underneath the warmth and the kindness and the famous charm, because there was a great deal more to Georgiana than the world that adored her surface ever guessed, a whole hidden country of mind and talent that her marriage left almost entirely untouched, and we cannot understand what she went looking for, or why the great friendship answered such a deep need in her, until we have seen the full size of the person who went looking. Let us look, then, at Georgiana's mind. There is a version of Georgiana that the satirists drew, and that has clung to her ever since. the version in which she is nothing but a beautiful, frivolous, spendthrift creature of fashion, a clothes horse and a gambler, and a giddy ornament of society. It is worth setting against that picture the harder evidence of her mind, because she had a real one, and the neglect of it is one of the quieter injustices done to her by her own age and by ours. Georgiana was clever. She read, she wrote, she thought, she pursued serious interests with a seriousness that her public role left little room to display, and a fuller portrait of her and of the marriage has to make space for the woman of intellect underneath the woman of fashion. She was, for one thing, a writer. Only a few years into her marriage, while still in her early 20s, she wrote and published, anonymously, a novel. It was called The Sylph, and it appeared in print without her name attached to it, as such things did when the author was a great lady who could not be seen to scribble for the public. The novel told the story of a young woman thrust into the dangerous, glittering, corrupting world of high society, married into a fashionable life full of gambling and intrigue, and the perils that beset a woman in such a position, and it does not take much imagination to see in it the working out, in fiction, of Georgiana's own situation, her own early bewilderment at the life she had married into, her own sense of the traps that lay in wait for a young woman of her position. It was a real novel, read and reprinted, and it reveals a mind observing its own world with a sharper and more anxious clarity than her outward gaiety ever betrayed. She went on writing all her life, poetry above all, some of it accomplished enough to be admired by serious judges, a private vein of expression running alongside the public performance. More surprising, to those who know only the fashion plate, was her passion for the sciences and for the hard, exacting, and glamorous study of the natural world. Georgiana became seriously interested in mineralogy and in chemistry, the new and exciting sciences of her day, and she pursued these interests not as a fashionable affectation, but with real and sustained attention. She assembled a substantial collection of mineral specimens, gathered from across Europe and beyond, a collection of genuine scientific value. She corresponded with men of science. She studied, she read the chemical literature. She conducted, in her way, the amateur investigations that an intelligent and wealthy enthusiast of the period could pursue. There is something rather wonderful in the image of the most famous beauty in England, the Queen of Fashion, whose hats and hairstyles a nation copied, bent over a tray of rock specimens, absorbed in the classification of minerals, exercising a side of herself that the admirers who loved her surface had no idea existed. The travels of her exile, grim as they were in their occasion, gave this scientific passion some scope, for the continent was full of the sights and specimens and savants that interested her, and even in the misery of her banishment she found, in that study, something to engage the part of her mind that her ordinary life starved. It is a poignant detail, the disgraced and grieving Duchess turning, in a foreign exile, to the consolations of rock and chemistry, or the patient impersonal order of the mineral kingdom, so far removed from the human chaos that had brought her there. The mind that could lose itself in such study was a serious mind, and it deserves to be remembered alongside the gambling and the gowns. What is striking, and what bears on our story, is how little of this side of her the marriage engaged. The Duke was not a man of science or of letters. He had no particular interest in his wife's novel, her poetry, her minerals, her chemical studies. These were pursuits she followed on her own, in the company of friends who shared them, in a region of her life that her husband simply did not enter. Here was another whole continent of Georgiana, the thinking, reading, writing, investigating woman, and her husband was as absent from it as he was from the rest of her inner life. The marriage that failed to meet her emotionally failed to meet her intellectually too. She was a person of more parts than anyone knew, and the man she had married was incurious about almost all of them, content with the suitable, decorative, dynastically useful Duchess, and indifferent to the complicated and interesting woman inside the role. It would be too neat to say that her interests outside the marriage were simply compensations for what the marriage lacked, though some of them surely were. The writing, the science, the wide intellectual friendships were also, more simply, the natural expressions of an active and able mind that would have sought such outlets in any case. But they belong in the portrait, and they belong in the story of the marriage, because they show us once again how much of Georgiana lay beyond her husband's reach or interest, how large and varied a person was contained inside the famous Duchess, and how little of that largeness the man she lived with ever troubled to discover. He had married a girl of 17 for her suitability. He had got a woman of remarkable range and depth, and he seems never quite to have noticed. We return now to the unfolding of her story, and to the friendship that was about to change everything, the meeting at Bath with the woman who would become the third point of her household. Picture the city of Bath in the early 1780s, because it is one of the loveliest things the 18th century made, and because it is where the great friendship began. The city rises in tiers of pale golden stone up the sides of a green valley, terrace above terrace, crescent above crescent, the most fashionable resort in England, built for the pleasures and the ailments of the leisured classes. People came to Bath to take the famous waters for their health, and to do everything else that a gathering of rich and idle people implies, to gamble and gossip and dance and look at one another and be looked at. The streets were full of sedan chairs and fine carriages. The pump room hummed with conversation over glasses of the warm mineral water. In the assembly rooms there were balls, and concerts and card parties. It was a place where people met, where reputations were made and unmade, where a great lady might escape the heavy formality of London for a season of lighter society. And it was here, in the spring of 1782, that the Duchess of Devonshire met Lady Elizabeth Foster. The meeting itself has come down to us, wrapped in a little of the glow that hindsight lends to the beginnings of great loves, but we can reconstruct its essentials. Georgiana was at Bath that season, so was Bess, drifting through the resort on the edges of fashionable society, a young woman of good birth and ruined fortunes with nowhere in particular to be. They were introduced, as people were, in the easy mingling of a watering place where rank met rank over the waters and at the assemblies, and the connection between them was immediate and total, one of those rare meetings where two people connect at once and fall, within hours, into an intimacy that ordinarily takes years to build. By the accounts that survive, they talked as though they had been waiting all their lives for the conversation. Each found in the other exactly the thing she most needed, and the speed of it astonished even themselves. For Georgiana, lonely at the centre of her glittering marriage, here suddenly was a companion who seemed to understand her completely, who gave back the tenderness she poured out, who wanted nothing from her at first but her friendship, and offered, in return, an adoration as total as her own. For Bess, adrift and desperate, here was rescue in the form of the most powerful and generous woman in England, taking her up, wanting her, opening a door into a world of safety and splendour she had thought closed to her forever. Whatever else we make of what followed, the beginning of it was a genuine meeting of two hearts that had each been looking for the other, and the force of that first connection explains everything about how completely and how fatefully the two women's lives would now entwine. She was always called Bess. She was 23, almost the same age as Georgiana, and she had arrived in Bath at the lowest point of a young life that had already gone badly wrong. Bess was the daughter of an earl, the Earl of Bristol, a famously eccentric and absent bishop nobleman who scattered children and obligations across Europe and attended to none of them reliably. She had been married young to a man named John Thomas Foster, an Irish member of Parliament who had proved, by her account and most others, cold and harsh and impossible to live with. The marriage had collapsed, and here the law of the age showed its full brutality, because when a marriage of that kind broke, it was the wife who lost everything. Bess had separated from her husband, and in doing so had been cut off from his money, and worse, had lost her two small sons, who in law belonged to their father, absolutely, and whom she was not permitted to keep, or for long stretches even to see. She was, in the spring of 1782, a young woman of good birth and no money, estranged from a cruel husband, deprived of her children, dependent on the grudging charity of relatives, drifting through a fashionable city she could not afford, with no settled home and no clear future. She was also, by every account, enchanting. That word matters, because the question of what Bess was, of whether she was a wronged innocent or a clever manipulator, a true friend or a cuckoo in the nest, has divided everyone who has ever looked at this story, and we will have to keep returning to it. But whatever else she was enchanting, and she knew how to make people love her, and on the day she met Georgiana she turned that gift on the one person in England most susceptible to it. For Georgiana, remember, was a woman starved of intimacy, married to a wall, surrounded by admirers but short of true companions, longing for someone to whom she could give the whole of her warm and lonely heart. And here, suddenly, was a woman her own age, beautiful and unfortunate and grateful and adoring, a woman with no money and no home and nowhere to belong, a woman, in short, who needed exactly what Georgiana most needed to give. It was less like a meeting than a recognition. Within a remarkably short time they were inseparable. The intensity of it is striking even now, and it can be hard for a modern reader to know quite how to take it. The two women became devoted to each other with a completeness that went far beyond ordinary friendship. They wrote to each other in the language of lovers, full of longing and endearment and the ache of separation. They gave each other pet names. They could not bear to be apart. Georgiana, who had been looking all her married life for someone to pour her affection into, poured it into Bess, and Bess, who had nothing and no one, received it and returned it and made herself indispensable. Whether the bond was, in any physical sense, a romance, we cannot know and probably should not try too hard to decide. The friendships of women in that period often used a heated, passionate language that did not necessarily mean what the same words would mean today. What is certain is that the feeling was real and enormous, and that for Georgiana it filled a place in her life that had stood empty since her wedding day. She had found, at last, someone who seemed to love her as much as she loved them. That it was a woman, and not the husband who should have done it, is the whole point. There was, of course, the matter of Bess's circumstances, which were desperate, and which Georgiana, being Georgiana, immediately set about relieving. She could not bear that her beloved new friend should be poor and homeless and adrift. She had a great house, several of them, in fact, and limitless means, and a heart that could not look at need without trying to fix it. The solution was obvious to her, and she pursued it with all the warmth of her nature. Bess must come and live with them. Bess must be folded into the household, given a home, a place, security, the family she had lost. It was meant as pure kindness, and in Georgiana's mind it surely was pure kindness, the natural overflow of her love for her friend. She seems not to have paused, in the first flush of the attachment, to consider what it might mean to install a beautiful, charming, desperate and adoring young woman permanently in a house that also contained a cool and silent husband whose affections had never been securely engaged by anyone. She did not pause, because pausing to calculate was not in her. She loved Bess, and she wanted to rescue her, and so she opened the doors of her marriage and brought her in. What came of that, the slow forming of the strangest household in England, is the next part of the story, and we must approach it carefully, because it is the part where everything begins to turn. The bringing of Bess into the household did not happen all at once, with a single decision and a packed trunk. It happened the way these things usually happen, by degrees, a visit extended, an absence regretted, a temporary arrangement that quietly became permanent. Bess came to stay. She was so charming, so grateful, so easy to have about, that her staying seemed only natural. She fitted herself into the life of the house with a skill that her detractors would later call calculation, and her defenders would call the survival instinct of a woman who had nowhere else to go. She made herself useful. She made herself loved, and she set about, with what we now know was conscious effort, winning over not only Georgiana, who was already won, but the one member of the household who mattered most and was hardest to reach. The Duke. Here the story darkens, and we have to be honest about what we can see and what we cannot. What we can see is that Bess, the penniless friend taken in out of charity, set herself to please the Duke of Devonshire, and that she succeeded where his own wife had failed. Where Georgiana's affection had bounced off the Duke's reserve for years, Bess found a way in. She was clever about it. She did not compete with Georgiana for the spotlight. She had no spotlight and wanted none, and a quiet, attentive, undemanding companion was precisely the kind of presence the Duke could tolerate. She was restful where Georgiana was dazzling. She asked nothing and offered everything. She seems to have understood the Duke's nature better than the Duchess ever did, to have grasped that a man like that could not be reached through brilliance or display, only through a patient, low, undemanding attention that did not threaten his composure. And so, while Georgiana lit up the rooms beyond, Bess quietly made herself essential to the man at home, and somewhere in the months and years after she joined the household, she became his mistress. We do not know the exact moment. Of course, these things were not recorded, but by the middle of the 1780s it was an established fact within the household and an open secret beyond it that Lady Elizabeth Foster, the Duchess's beloved friend, was also the Duke's lover. The wife's dearest companion and the husband's mistress were the same woman. The penniless guest taken in out of kindness had become, in the most intimate sense, a second wife, and the three of them went on living together year after year in an arrangement that scandalized and fascinated the whole of fashionable England, and that the three principals themselves seem, against every expectation, to have made work. Try to feel the strangeness of it from Georgiana's position, because it is almost unbearable when you do. The husband who would not give her his heart had given it, or some part of it, to her own best friend. The woman she loved more than anyone in the world was sleeping with her husband. By every ordinary measure, this should have destroyed her, and destroyed the friendship, and blown the household apart. It did not, and the reason it did not is the strangest and most human thing in this whole tangled story. Georgiana loved Bess too much to lose her. The bond between the two women was, if anything, deeper and more necessary to Georgiana than her bond with her husband had ever been. The Duke had never truly been hers to lose. He had been distant from the first day. But Bess was the great love of her life, the person who had filled the emptiness, and Georgiana could more easily share her husband than give up her friend. So she did the thing that looks from outside like weakness or folly or self-abasement, and may have been in part all of those, but was also in its way a kind of fierce loyalty. She kept Bess. She absorbed the betrayal, if betrayal is even the right word for something so tangled, and she held on to the love that mattered to her, and she let the rest stand. It is tempting to see Bess as the villain of the piece, and many have, the schemer who repaid charity by stealing both husband and household, the cuckoo who pushed her way into the warm nest of another woman's life. There is evidence for that reading, and it would be foolish to dismiss it entirely. Bess was ambitious, she was needy, she was without resources, and therefore without scruple in the way that people stripped of all security often become, and she ended, as we shall see, by getting almost everything she could have wanted. But there is another reading, and the truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the difficult middle. Bess genuinely loved Georgiana. The letters that survive are not the letters of a cold operator. They are full of real feeling, real distress at separation, real attachment that lasted decades, and through circumstances that would have dissolved a merely strategic friendship long since. It is possible, and I think it is the likeliest truth, that Bess loved them both, the Duchess and the Duke, in different ways, and that she was not so much a calculating intruder as a woman who, given nothing by life, took the security and the affection that were offered and clung to them with both hands, telling herself, perhaps half believing, that no one was being harmed. What is certain is that by the mid-1780s, the household at Devonshire House and Chatsworth had become a thing without parallel in the society of its time. 3 people, bound together by love and need and complicity, living as a kind of family, the wife and the mistress devoted to each other, the husband calmly content at the centre of it. The world watched and gossiped and could not understand it. The 3 of them lived inside it and for the most part did. How it actually worked day to day, what it was like to inhabit that triangle, is something worth looking at closely, because it is the heart of this whole story, and the thing that everyone, then and since, has most wanted to understand. So picture what it was actually like, this household of 3. We should resist the easy modern picture, the lurid one, because the reality was at once stranger and more domestic than scandal imagines. The 3 of them did not live in a continuous fever of jealousy and intrigue. They lived, most of the time, an ordinary life of an extraordinary kind, the life of a wealthy aristocratic family that simply happened to contain one more adult than such families usually did. They travelled together, they dined together, they sat through the long evenings together in the great drawing rooms of Devonshire House and Chatsworth, the Duke at his cards, Georgiana writing her endless letters, Bess at her needlework or her book, the candles burning down, the conversation such as it was passing among them. To a visitor who did not know the truth, they might have looked like nothing more than a duke, a duchess, and the Duchess's companion, a perfectly common arrangement in great houses of the period. The truth ran underneath, unspoken, woven into the fabric of every ordinary day. The Duke was the still centre of it, and that is the thing most worth understanding, because it tells us more about him than almost anything else in his life. He had, in effect, two women devoted to him under one roof, and he received their devotion with the same unruffled composure he brought to everything. He did not flaunt the arrangement, and he did not agonize over it. He let it be. One reading of this is the cold one, that he was a man of such fundamental detachment that he could keep a wife and a mistress in the same house without any inconvenient stirring of conscience or feeling, taking what each offered and troubling himself about nothing. Another reading is gentler, that he was a man who, having never learned to express affection, found in this odd domestic triangle a kind of stability that suited him, two people who loved each other and both, in their fashion, loved him, an arrangement that asked little of his limited emotional resources and gave him steady company without the demand for displays he could not produce. Both readings fit the few facts we have. He remains, even here, at the very centre of the most intimate arrangement of his life, a closed door. For Georgiana, the daily reality was a constant negotiation of feeling that must have cost her more than she ever let show. She had Bess, which was what she wanted most. She also had to live every day with the knowledge of what Bess and the Duke were to each other, and to manage her own heart around that knowledge, and to keep the surface smooth for the sake of the thing she could not bear to lose. There were strains. The letters show them, the flashes of jealousy and hurt, the periods of tension, the times when the arrangement bent under the weight of what it was asking of everyone. But the remarkable fact is how seldom it broke, and how much genuine affection seems to have flowed among all three of them through the years. They were not three people trapped in a hateful compromise. They were, much of the time, three people who had built an unconventional life together and found in it a real, if complicated, contentment. The wider public, naturally, would not leave it alone. The arrangement was the talk of London, the subject of knowing remarks and cruel caricatures and endless speculation. Polite society both devoured the scandal and pretended not to know about it, in the way of polite societies everywhere. The satirists, who had already made Georgiana a favourite target for her fashions, and her gambling and her dabbling in politics, found in the triangle a gift that kept giving. The Duke's apparent placidity in the middle of it struck people as either admirably dignified or grotesquely unfeeling, depending on their disposition. And through it all the three of them maintained in public the fiction that Bess was simply the Duchess's dear friend and companion, a fiction that fooled almost no one, and that everyone, by a kind of general agreement, consented to leave undisturbed. There is one more thing to say about the triangle before we follow it into its next and most complicated phase, and it concerns the nature of Georgiana's choice. It is easy, looking back, to pity her, to see her as a victim, the betrayed wife too weak to defend her own marriage, manipulated by a scheming friend and neglected by a cold husband. There is truth in that, but it is not the whole truth, and it does her an injustice to leave it there. Because Georgiana was not simply a victim of the arrangement. She was, in a real sense, its author. She had brought Bess into the house. She chose again and again, over many years and against every conventional pressure, to keep her there. She decided that the friendship was worth the cost, that she would rather share her husband than lose the woman she loved, and she lived by that decision with a constancy that, whatever else you think of it, was not weakness. It was a choice about what mattered most to her, made clear-eyed enough after the first years and held to. She valued love, the love she gave and the love she received from Bess, above the proprieties of marriage and above the wounded pride that would have driven another woman to cast the intruder out. In an age that gave women almost no power over their own lives, Georgiana exercised what power she had to keep close to her the person she most wanted, and she paid for it, and she did not complain of the price in any way that reached the public ear. But before the triangle turned to the tangle of its children, it passed through one singular, vivid public interlude that showed the marriage in an entirely different light, the one episode in which Georgiana's gifts and her husband's world pulled together toward a single end. For in the spring of 1784, in the middle of all this private complication, the Duchess of Devonshire walked out of the drawing-room and into the streets, and threw herself into the dirtiest and most exhilarating political fight of the age. We turn next to the Westminster election, and to the few intoxicating weeks when Georgiana became not the queen of fashion, but a force in the politics of the nation. In the spring of 1784 there came an episode that showed Georgiana at her most dazzling and her most reckless, that fused her two worlds, the social and the political, into a single scandalous public spectacle, and that demonstrated, as nothing else in her life quite did, the one arena in which her particular gifts and her husband's interests genuinely combined. It was an election, the great Westminster election, one of the fiercest electoral contests of the age, and into it Georgiana threw herself with a passion and a flair that made her, for a few intoxicating weeks, the most talked about woman in England for reasons that had nothing to do with her gowns. The cause was the cause of Charles James Fox, the great Whig leader, the brilliant, dissolute, magnetic champion of the party whose unofficial headquarters was Devonshire House itself. Fox was standing for the seat of Westminster, one of the few constituencies in the unreformed system with a genuinely large and popular electorate, where a man had to win the votes of tradesmen and shopkeepers and ordinary citizens, not merely the nod of a patron. It was a real contest, hard-fought and bitter, and the Whigs needed every advantage they could find. And Georgiana, the queen of their world, the most famous and adored woman in the country, the presiding genius of the house where their whole faction gathered, became their most spectacular weapon. She went out into the streets of Westminster, and she canvassed for votes. This was an extraordinary thing for a duchess to do, and it scandalized half the country. Great ladies did not go down among the common people and solicit their votes. It was undignified, unwomanly, a violation of every rule about where a woman of her rank belonged and what she might decently do. But Georgiana did it, and she did it with all the warmth and charm and irresistible personal magic that had made her famous. She went into the shops and the streets. She talked to the tradesmen and their wives. She begged and cajoled and dazzled. She turned the full force of her personality on the ordinary voters of Westminster, and they responded as everyone always responded to her, by falling under her spell. The most notorious story, true or embellished, was that she won votes by kissing the men who would promise them, that she traded kisses for votes with the butchers and the tradesmen of Westminster, and whether or not it happened exactly so, the story flew around the country and fixed her in the public imagination as a woman who had crossed every line. The press fell on her with a savagery that is shocking even now. The caricaturists and the pamphleteers, who had long made her a target, now had everything they could wish for: a duchess in the streets, kissing tradesmen for votes, meddling in the dirty business of politics that was no place for a woman. The prints that poured out were vicious and often obscene, depicting her as a wanton, a woman who had abandoned all decency, trading her body for political advantage. The abuse was relentless and deeply personal, and it wounded her, for all her bravado. She had stepped outside the role her age permitted a woman, and her world punished her for it with a ferocity that revealed how narrow that role really was, how little license even the grandest woman in England had to act in the public sphere as a man might act without comment, and yet she persisted, and the cause she fought for prevailed. Fox won his seat after a contest of weeks, and Georgiana's canvassing was widely credited as having helped to carry him over the line. She had done something real, something that mattered, something that affected the political fortunes of her party and her country, and she had done it with the only instruments her position allowed her, her charm, her fame, her personal magnetism, the soft power of a woman, in a world that gave women no hard power at all. It was, in its way, a triumph, the moment when the gifts that society prized in her as ornament were turned to genuine effect when the celebrated Duchess became, briefly, a political force. This was the one region where Georgiana and the Devonshire interest truly pulled together, the one arena in which her brilliance served her husband's world rather than merely decorating it. The Duke cared about the Whig cause in his silent, grand way. Devonshire House was its citadel, and Georgiana's labours in the streets of Westminster advanced the very interest that her husband's name and money and roof existed to support. In the political sphere, the mismatched couple were for once allies, contributing in their utterly different fashions to a single end, his weight and her warmth working toward the same victory. It is one of the few places in the whole long marriage where we can see them, however indirectly, as partners. The public marriage, the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire as a political institution, worked rather well, even as the private marriage of William and Georgiana strained and starved. We turn now back to that private life and to the children who were beginning, in these same years, to complicate the strange household still further. The children complicated everything, because children could not be kept secret in the way an affair could. An affair was a matter of glances and absences and things not said, deniable, manageable, smoothed over by the general agreement of society not to look too closely. A child was a fact, a body, a person who came into the world on a particular day and had to be accounted for. And so when Bess found herself carrying the Duke's child, the unconventional family was forced into an elaborate machinery of concealment that would be almost comic if the human cost beneath it were not so real. The solution, repeated more than once, was distance and disguise. Bess would travel abroad, to the continent, where she was not known, where a woman might give birth quietly under an assumed name and arrange for the infant to be placed and the secret kept. She went to France, to Italy, moving through the watering places and lodging houses of Europe, where the English gentry drifted, and where awkward private business could be transacted out of sight of London. There, away from the watching eyes of home, she bore the Duke 2 children through the 1780s, a daughter and a son. The daughter, born in 1785, was given the name Caroline. The son, born in 1788, was called Augustus. They were the Duke's children, half-siblings to the legitimate Cavendish children who would in time fill the nursery at Devonshire House, and their arrival was managed with all the secrecy and shame that the age demanded of children born outside marriage. The concealment was not only Bess's burden, Georgiana was deep in it too, complicit in the deception, helping to arrange the cover stories, sharing the secret, supporting her friend through confinements that were also, in the most painful possible sense, the issue of her own husband. Imagine the position. Your beloved friend is abroad, giving birth to your husband's child, and your task is to help hide it from the world, to manage the fiction, to be ready to receive the child into a family that cannot acknowledge it. The tangle of feeling in that is almost beyond unravelling. And yet Georgiana did it, and did it without, so far as we can tell, turning on either of them, because the alternative was the rupture of the bonds she could not live without. What became of the children is the part that does Georgiana the most credit, and reveals, again, the thing at the centre of her nature. The little ones were brought, in time, into the orbit of the household, raised under cover stories that fooled the curious, their true parentage an open secret managed by silence. Caroline and Augustus grew up around the family, cared for, educated, provided for. And Georgiana, the wife whose husband had fathered them on her own friend, helped to mother them. She did not hold their origins against them. They were children, and they needed loving. And loving children was what she did. The household that had begun with the taking in of the Duke's first illegitimate daughter, Charlotte Williams, now widened to take in 2 more children of the Duke, these ones born of the friend who shared the marriage, and Georgiana drew them all into the same capacious, undiscriminating embrace. It is worth standing back here to take in the full picture of that household, because it had become by the late 1780s one of the most unusual families in England, and its unusualness flowed directly from the characters of the 3 adults at its head. Under one set of roofs there were gathered the Duke's daughter from before his marriage, the legitimate Cavendish children Georgiana would bear, and the Duke's children by Bess, all of them being raised together, with varying degrees of openness about who was whose. The lines that the age drew so harshly between legitimate and illegitimate, between the true-born heir and the child of shame, were not erased in that household because they could not be erased. They governed inheritance and rank and everything that mattered outside. But within the walls, in the daily life of the nursery and the schoolroom, the children were, to a remarkable degree, simply children together, and the woman who presided over them loved them with a warmth that did not pause over the circumstances of their birth. That was Georgiana's doing. Whatever the Duke's coldness, whatever Bess's calculations, it was the Duchess who made the strange family a family rather than a collection of secrets, and who gave the children at its margins a place at its heart. We should not pretend the arrangement was without pain for anyone. The children born outside marriage carried all their lives, the weight of their irregular origins, the half-truths, the things that could not be said. Bess's relationship with her own children by the Duke was constrained by the need for secrecy in ways that must have cost her whatever else she gained from the arrangement. And Georgiana, mothering her husband's children by her friend, can hardly have done so without moments of grief for the strangeness of her own life. But the dominant note, when we look at the household over these years, is not misery. It is a kind of resilient, improvised tenderness, a family making itself up as it went along, holding together against the conventions that should have torn it apart, sustained by the love of a woman who had more of it to give than anyone quite knew what to do with. And in the midst of all this, the thing Georgiana had longed for from the very beginning finally came to pass. After the years of failure and miscarriage and self-blame, she began at last to bear children who lived. The nursery filled, the duty was on its way to being done, and the woman who had mothered everyone else's children would at last have her own to mother. That is where we turn now, to the daughters, and then to the son who changed everything. The first of Georgiana's own children to live was a daughter, born in the summer of 1783, after 9 years of marriage, and all the sorrow that had filled them. They named her Georgiana, after her mother, and within the family she was always called Little G, to distinguish the small one from the great one. 2 years later, in 1785, came a second daughter, christened Henrietta, and known all her life as Harriot. After so long, after the miscarriages and the public anxiety and the quiet self-reproach, Georgiana was a mother at last, and the relief and joy of it pour off the pages of her letters. She doted on the girls. She was, by the standards of her class and time, an unusually involved and affectionate parent, wanting her daughters near her, interesting herself in their care and their characters and their education, loving them with the same overflowing tenderness she gave to everyone she loved, which is to say, completely. It is worth pausing on what kind of mother she was, because it cuts again against the frivolous picture. The aristocratic mother of the 18th century was often a remote figure, the children handed to wet nurses and nursemaids and governesses, seen at appointed hours, raised at arm's length by a small army of paid staff. Georgiana had all the staff that her rank provided, but she did not keep her children at arm's length. She wanted them with her. She wrote about them constantly, worried over their health, delighted in their sayings, fretted about their futures. She even, in defiance of the usual practice among great ladies, insisted for a time on nursing her own children herself, an inclination her family and the Devonshire household regarded as eccentric and pressed her to give up. The point is that motherhood, when it finally came, engaged the deepest and best part of her. The woman who needed so badly to love and be loved found in her daughters an object for that need that asked nothing complicated of her. No negotiation of jealousy, no reading of an unreadable face, only the simple, returnable love of a child for its mother. After everything, the nursery was the one room in her life where the feeling ran clear. There is a particular tenderness in the way she wrote about her children that lifts straight off the page even now, 2 centuries later, when she was parted from them by the demands of the season or by travel. She ached for them, and said so, in letters that read less like the productions of a great lady performing maternal sentiment than like the unguarded outpourings of a woman missing the people she loved most. She fretted that the girls were growing up too fast, that she was missing things, that the hours the role demanded of the Duchess of Devonshire were hours stolen from the mother she would rather have been. There is a real conflict visible in this, the conflict of a woman pulled between the public role that defined her and the private love that fulfilled her, and it is a conflict that any parent who has ever had to leave a child for work will recognize in an instant. The most glamorous woman in England, who could have handed her daughters wholesale to an army of nurses and gone on with her dazzling life, instead kept reaching back toward the nursery, kept wanting to be there, kept counting the cost of every absence. It is one of the most quietly humanizing things about her. This hunger to mother her own children in an age and a class that expected her to do no such thing. The girls grew up inside the odd, capacious household we have been describing, among the half-siblings and the secrets, and they grew up, by all accounts, knowing themselves loved. Little G was the more conventional of the two, steadier, more biddable, the kind of daughter who fitted the mould the world had cut for her. Harriot the younger was sharper, more observant, more inclined to see through the surfaces of the adult life around her, and her later letters and recollections are among our best windows onto the family, because she watched it all with a clear and not always forgiving eye. As a child, she could not have understood the full architecture of the household, the exact relations among her mother and her father and the woman called Lady Elizabeth who was always there. But children sense the shape of the world they live in even when they cannot name it, and the Devonshire children grew up inside an arrangement whose tensions they absorbed long before they could have explained them. For Georgiana, the daughters were a profound happiness, but they did not, in the cold dynastic logic of the thing, discharge her duty. Daughters could not inherit the dukedom. The estates and the title and the whole vast Cavendish patrimony required a son, a male heir of the duke's body, and until one arrived, the central anxiety of the marriage remained unresolved. 2 healthy daughters were a blessing and a relief, proof that Georgiana could bear living children, but they were not the thing the marriage was for. The pressure that had hung over her from her wedding day did not lift with their births. If anything, it sharpened, because now she had shown she could carry a child to term, and the only question left was whether she could carry the right kind, the boy who would secure everything. She loved her girls without reservation. The world, looking over her shoulder, still waited for a son. There is a poignancy in this that is easy to miss across the distance of the centuries. Here was a woman whose value to the institution she had married into was measured by her production of a male child, who had finally, after years of grief, produced 2 children she adored, and who was given to understand, by the silence of expectation all around her, that her real work was still undone. She does not seem to have loved her daughters one particle less for their failure to be sons. But she cannot have been unaware that society ranked her children by a measure that had nothing to do with her own heart, that a son not yet conceived already counted for more, in the eyes of the family and the law and the watching public, than the 2 daughters she held in her arms. It is one more instance of the gap that ran through her whole life, between the love she felt and gave so freely, and the cold transactional terms on which her age insisted on valuing her. And then, in the spring of 1790, after 16 years of marriage, the thing the whole arrangement had been waiting for finally happened. Georgiana bore a son. The relief of it, the magnitude of it, the way it transformed her position in an instant, is the next part of the story, and it marks the high point of her life as the Duchess of Devonshire, the moment when she had, at last and against the odds, done everything that had been asked of her. We turn now to the birth of the heir. He was born in May of 1790, and he was a boy, and with his first cry, the great unanswered question of Georgiana's married life was answered at last. The Cavendishes had their heir. They named him William, the family name, the name of his father and his grandfather, and the long line of dukes behind them, and he was given the courtesy title that the heir to the dukedom carried, Marquess of Hartington. Within the family he was called Hart, and Hart he remained. After 16 years after the miscarriages and the daughters and the slow grinding pressure of a duty undischarged, Georgiana had produced the son who secured everything, and the relief that swept through the household and out into the watching world was enormous. It is worth seeing how that relief looked when it spilled out of the house and into the country at large, because the birth of a Cavendish heir was not a private family matter, but a public event, an occasion of rejoicing across the vast estates that the boy would one day inherit. On the Devonshire lands in Derbyshire, the news was met with the kind of celebration that the age reserved for dynastic triumphs. Bonfires were lit on the hills, bells were rung in the village churches, oxen were roasted whole for the tenants, and barrels of ale were broached, and the people who lived and worked on the estates that fed the family's enormous fortune gathered to drink the health of the infant who had just secured the line of their masters into the next generation. To a child born on those acres in the same season, it might have seemed that the whole world was glad, and in a sense the whole of the Devonshire estate was, because the arrival of the heir guaranteed the continuity on which every steward and tenant and servant depended. A great house without an heir was a house with a question mark over its future. Now the question was answered, and the answer was cause for fires on the hilltops, and meat on the tables of people who would never see the child whose birth they celebrated. Georgiana, recovering in her chamber with her son beside her, had given all these distant strangers a reason to rejoice, and had given herself, at last, the unassailable place in the family that only a son could confer. For Georgiana herself it was a vindication and a release. From the day of her wedding she had carried the knowledge that her place was not entirely secure until she gave the Duke a son, that whatever her fame and her charm and her position, she had not done the one essential thing. Now she had done it. The anxiety that had shadowed 16 years lifted. She had given the family its future, the estates their heir, the dukedom its continuation. Whatever else happened, whatever the strains of the strange household, and the coolness of her husband, and the debts and difficulties that pressed on her from other directions, she had succeeded in the thing she had been married to do. It is hard to overstate what that meant to a woman in her position. It was not merely a private joy, though it was certainly that, the simple happiness of a mother with a longed-for child. It was a settling of accounts with the whole apparatus of expectation that had governed her life. She had paid the debt that her marriage was contracted to collect. The Duke's response predictably, "We cannot read with any confidence." He had his heir, the thing every great nobleman needed, and that his marriage had been arranged to provide, and a man of his temperament must have felt, beneath the unmoving surface, a deep satisfaction at the securing of his line. Whether he showed Georgiana any feeling at the achievement of it, whether the birth of his son moved him to any expression of gratitude or tenderness toward the wife who had given him so much grief and so much waiting before producing this prize, we do not know, because he left no record of feeling, and the people around him recorded none on his behalf. We are left to imagine the scene as best we can, the Duke regarding his newborn son with whatever passed, behind that heavy composed face, for joy. It is one of the many moments in this marriage where we long to know what he felt and are given only the blank. But for Georgiana the birth of heart marked something like the summit of her life, the high point from which, though she could not have known it, the long descent would begin. In the spring of 1790 she had everything. She was the most celebrated creature in the kingdom, the leader of fashion, the queen of Whig society, the centre of a brilliant world. She had her daughters, whom she adored. She had Bess, the friend who completed her. And now she had her son, the heir, the final piece, the thing that made her position unassailable. If we wanted to freeze the story at its happiest, this is the frame we would choose. The Duchess of Devonshire in 1790, 32 years old, triumphant, surrounded by the people she loved, having at last done everything that was asked of her. Hold that image, because it does not last. For underneath the triumph, troubles were already gathering that would, within a very few years, bring this whole bright structure down. There were the debts, first of all, the secret, mounting, ruinous gambling debts that Georgiana had been accumulating for years and concealing from her husband, debts that would grow into a private catastrophe vast enough to threaten everything. There was the restlessness of her own heart, never satisfied by the cool marriage, always reaching for the warmth it could not find at home, a restlessness that would soon lead her into the most dangerous attachment of her life. And there was the simple fact that the household of three, for all its resilient tenderness, was built on tensions that could not be suppressed forever. The high point of 1790 sat on top of a structure with deep cracks in its foundations, and the cracks were already spreading. So let us leave Georgiana at her summit for a moment, with her son in her arms and her duty done, and the applause of the world around her, and turn to the first of the forces that would undo her. Not the love affair, not yet. Something quieter and more corrosive, something that had been eating at the foundations of her life for years, while the world saw only the glitter. The debts, the gambling, the secret weight she carried, season after season, hidden from the husband whose composure she could not bear to disturb, and whose money was the only thing that could save her. To understand how far she would eventually fall, we have to understand what she was hiding, and how heavy it had become. There is a kind of fear that lives in the body, the fear of a secret that grows heavier every month and can never be set down, and Georgiana lived with that fear for most of her adult life. The secret was money. From early in her marriage she had gambled, and she had gambled badly, and the losses had mounted, and rather than confess them she had borrowed to cover them, and then borrowed again to cover the borrowing, until she was caught in a spiral that no amount of charm could talk her out of. By the height of her fame she owed sums so large that they would have staggered the public who loved her, sums she could not begin to repay, sums she dared not reveal to the one person whose money could have cleared them, her husband. Gambling was woven into the fabric of her days, and it is important to understand that, because it makes her ruin less a personal weakness than a hazard of the life she was born into. The aristocracy of Georgian England gambled as a matter of course, at cards and at the new fashionable games, for stakes that could ruin a family in a night. Faro and other games of chance were the entertainment of every great drawing-room and every fashionable assembly. To play was not eccentric. It was expected, a mark of one's class and one's nerve. Georgiana threw herself into it, as she threw herself into everything, with passion and without restraint, and she had the worst possible combination of qualities for it. She was reckless, she was unlucky, she could not stop, and she could not bear to disappoint the people she owed. She would lose, and promise to pay, and borrow to pay, and lose again. The debts compounded like a disease. What made it a private agony rather than merely a financial problem was the secrecy. Georgiana could not tell the Duke. Partly this was the ordinary dread of any spouse who has run up debts behind the other's back, multiplied by the scale of what she owed. But it was more than that, and the more is characteristic of the whole marriage. She could not bear to disturb his composure, could not bear to be the cause of his displeasure, could not face the cold disappointment that she imagined. Probably rightly would meet her confession. Her relationship with her husband was already so fragile, so short of affection, so dependent on her keeping up the surface of a successful Duchess, that to confess herself a ruinous gambler felt like risking the little standing she had. And so she hid it. She hid it from him for years, paying off the most pressing creditors with fresh loans, juggling the obligations, living in a continual low terror of the moment the whole edifice would collapse, and the Duke would learn the truth. The strain of it tells in everything we know of her inner life during these years. Behind the famous gaiety, the woman who lit up every room was carrying a weight that never left her, doing sums in her head in the small hours, dreading the next demand, manoeuvring among her creditors and her money-lenders, with the desperate ingenuity of someone trying to keep a great many balls in the air at once. She turned to friends for loans she could not repay. She turned in the end to people whose help came at a price. The debts entangled her in obligations and dependencies that compromised her freedom and exposed her to pressure, and they are part of the reason her life grew so complicated, because a person in that much secret debt is never quite free, never quite able to act as she would choose, always to some degree at the mercy of those who know what she owes. The asymmetry of power between Georgiana and her husband is nowhere clearer than here. The Duke had money beyond reckoning. He could have cleared her debts a dozen times over without feeling the loss. But the money was his, and the disposing of it was his, and Georgiana's access to it depended entirely on his goodwill, which she could not be sure of. She was one of the richest women in England by marriage, and yet she was, in her own person, financially helpless, dependent on a husband who controlled everything and confided nothing. When the truth of her debts did eventually come out, as in stages it did, the Duke's response was the response of a man holding all the cards of displeasure and the imposition of terms, the relief of a creditor who has the debtor entirely in his power. The episode laid bare what the marriage was underneath the grandeur, an arrangement in which one party held all the power and the other was reduced, for all her fame, to the position of a suppliant, confessing her faults and hoping to be forgiven. The gambling debts matter to our story for two reasons. First, because they show us the secret unhappiness that ran beneath the brilliant surface, the way Georgiana's need for stimulation and excitement and the filling of inner emptiness drove her into a behaviour that slowly poisoned her life, a behaviour not unlike, in its compulsive reaching for a fix, the other appetites that would get her into trouble. And second, because the debts gave her husband a hold over her that would matter enormously when the real crisis came. For Georgiana was about to do the one thing that no amount of charm or fame or even a son and heir could excuse, the thing that would push the Duke from cold tolerance into cold judgment. And when that reckoning came, her debts would be part of the weight that crushed her resistance. She was about to fall in love, really in love, for the first time in her life, with a man who was not her husband, and it would cost her almost everything. That is where we turn next, to Charles Grey. Charles Grey was young, handsome, ardent, and ambitious, everything the Duke was not. He was a rising star of the Whig party, a gifted young politician with a great future before him, the kind of man who would one day stand at the very head of the nation's affairs. In the early 1790s, he was in his 20s, some years younger than Georgiana, and he moved in the same fashionable Whig circles that revolved around Devonshire House, the world of which Georgiana was the reigning queen. They met in that circle, the celebrated Duchess and the dazzling young man on his way up, and something kindled between them that neither of them, it seems, had the strength or the wish to put out. The contrast between Grey and the Duke could hardly have been sharper, and it is the contrast that explains the whole disaster. The Duke was nearly 9 years older than Georgiana, settled, immovable, sealed shut, a man who had never in their long marriage given her a single unguarded word of love. Grey was younger than she was, all fire and forward motion, a man at the dawn of a career that would carry him, decades later, to the very summit of British politics as the Prime Minister, who would force through the great reform of Parliament. In the early 1790s, he was not yet that towering figure. He was a passionate, gifted, hot-blooded young man in his 20s, and he looked at the most famous woman in the land, and saw not a duchess to be deferred to but a woman to be wanted, and he told her so. For Georgiana, who had spent her entire adult life reading a husband's blank face for a warmth that never came, the experience of being wanted openly, ardently, without reserve by a brilliant young man with the world before him was overwhelming. He gave her, in the simplest terms, the thing the Duke had withheld for nearly 20 years, the sensation of being the centre of someone's desire. After 2 decades of emotional drought, she was not equipped to refuse it. She had been starving so long that she did not stop to count the cost of the meal. For Georgiana it was, by every sign, the real thing at last, the love she had been reaching for her whole married life, and had never found at home. The Duke had never given her passion, never given her the sense of being adored, never made her feel that she was the centre of anyone's world. Bess had given her love, deep and necessary, but Bess was also, by now, her husband's mistress, and that love came wrapped in complications. Charles Grey gave her what she had never had, the ardent, exclusive devotion of a man who wanted her above everything, who found her not merely admirable or amusing but irresistible, who loved her in the loud, hungry, uncomplicated way she had been starving for since she was 17. It went to her head and her heart together. After a lifetime of being cherished by crowds and neglected by the one man who should have adored her, here was a man who put her first, and she could not resist him. The affair was reckless in a way that the careful arrangements of her household had never been. The triangle with Bess and the Duke, for all its scandal, was a stable thing, contained, managed, the kind of irregularity that great families absorbed and society agreed not to see. A love affair between the Duchess of Devonshire and a young politician was something else, dangerous, exposed, a thing that could not be folded quietly into the household, because it struck at the one line that even this most unconventional of marriages could not allow to be crossed. The Duke could tolerate, even prefer, an arrangement in which his wife's deepest attachment was to another woman who was also his own mistress, because that arrangement threatened nothing essential. He kept his wife, he kept his mistress, he kept his heir. The line of succession was secure, the appearances were maintained. A wife who fell in love with another man and risked bearing that man's child threatened the thing the whole edifice was built to protect, the certainty of the bloodline, the integrity of the inheritance. That was the one transgression the system could not absorb. And Georgiana, swept up in the first real passion of her life, transgressed it. She fell in love with Charles Grey, and the love was not platonic, and in the course of it she conceived a child that was not her husband's. This is the fact that turns the story from drama into catastrophe. A duchess's body, as we have seen, was never simply her own. Its chief function in the eyes of her world was to produce the legitimate heirs of her husband's house, and the absolute certainty that those heirs were her husband's was the foundation on which the entire aristocratic order rested. For a wife to carry another man's child was to introduce poison into that foundation. It did not matter how cold the husband had been, how starved the wife, how genuine the love. The system did not care about feelings, it cared about bloodlines, and Georgiana had endangered hers. We should be careful not to moralize here in either direction. It would be easy and false to paint Georgiana as simply a faithless wife getting her just deserts, when her marriage had given her so little and her age had bound her so tightly. It would be equally easy and equally false to paint her as a pure romantic heroine, a woman who followed her heart and was punished by a cruel society for the crime of loving. She was neither. She was a real and flawed and sympathetic human being, who after years of emotional starvation found something she desperately wanted, and reached for it without sufficient regard for the consequences, exactly as she had reached for the gaming tables and the applause of crowds, driven by the same restless hunger for the tenderness her life withheld. The affair with Grey belonged to the same deep pattern as the rest of her, the same reaching, the same recklessness, the same inability to govern a heart that wanted more than it was allowed. Only this time the stakes were total, for the consequences came down on her with the full weight of the age. When the situation became known, when it became clear that the Duchess of Devonshire was carrying a child that could not be the Duke's, the cold machinery of an 18th century aristocratic marriage swung into motion, and Georgiana discovered exactly how much power her husband held over her, and exactly how little she held over herself. The reckoning that followed was the great crisis of her life, the punishment that would tear her from her home and her children, and the man she loved all at once, and it would reveal the Duke, that unreadable man, in the one decisive action of his married life. We turn now to the reckoning. When the Duke acted, he acted as he did everything, without raising his voice, and the very quietness of it was the most frightening thing about it. Here, for once, the unreadable man became perfectly legible, because the situation admitted of only one response from a man in his position, and he gave it. His wife was carrying another man's child. The thing could not be hidden indefinitely, could not be folded into the household, could not be managed by the usual silences. It had to be dealt with, and dealt with in a way that protected the family, the inheritance, the name, and that punished the transgression unmistakably, even if the public was never to know the details. The Duke had the power to do all of this absolutely, and he used it. The terms he imposed were brutal in their simplicity, and they show with terrible clarity where the power in the marriage truly lay. Georgiana was to be sent away. She was to go abroad, into a kind of exile on the continent, removed from London and from society and from the man she loved, and she was to remain there in disgrace until the child was born and disposed of, and the scandal had cooled. And the instrument of her compliance, the lever that broke whatever resistance she might have offered, was her children. The Duke held the children. In law they were his absolutely, as all children were their father's. A wife had no rights over her own offspring that a husband was bound to respect. He could keep them from her entirely if he chose, and so the choice he set before her was the cruelest that could be devised for a woman of her loving nature. She could submit, go into exile, give up the child she was carrying, and be allowed, in time and on his terms, to return to her legitimate children. Or she could refuse and lose them all forever. We should let the full weight of that legal reality settle, because it is the iron beneath the whole velvet world we have been describing, and it governed the lives of every woman in it, the grandest as much as the humblest. A married woman in 18th century England had, in the eyes of the law, almost no separate existence at all. Her property, on marriage, became her husband's. Her body, in the most literal sense, was held to be at her husband's disposal. And her children were his, wholly and absolutely, with the mother possessing no legal right to their custody, their care, or even their company that a husband was in any way bound to honour. A father could remove his children from their mother entirely, could forbid her to see them, could dispose of their upbringing exactly as he wished, and the law would stand behind him at each step. This was not some peculiar cruelty of the Duke's. It was the settled condition of marriage itself, the framework inside which all wives in the country lived, What the crisis did was to strip away the comfortable padding of wealth and rank and fame that had disguised this reality in Georgiana's life, and show her, with sudden and total clarity, that for all her celebrity, she stood on exactly the same powerless ground as every other married woman in England. When the moment of true conflict came, she had nothing. Her husband had everything, and the children she loved more than her life were the rope he could pull at will. There was no real choice in it, and the Duke knew there was none. Georgiana loved her children with the whole of her being. They were, with Bess, the centre of her life and the truest expression of her nature. To be cut off from little G and Harrio and her precious heart was unthinkable. So she submitted. She agreed to everything. She would go abroad. She would bear the child in secret. She would give it up. She would accept her punishment and her exile in exchange for the eventual restoration of her place among her own children. The most famous, most adored, most apparently powerful woman in England was reduced, in the privacy of her own marriage, to a suppliant bargaining for permission to see her babies, and the man across the table held every card. It is worth sitting with the full asymmetry of this, because it is the truth that the glittering surface of her life always hid. For all her fame, for all the crowds that worshipped her, and the fashions she set, and the politics she meddled in, Georgiana had, in the end, no power at all over the things that mattered most to her. Her body, her children, her home, her freedom of movement, all of these belonged, in the last analysis, to her husband. And when she crossed the one line he could not permit, he simply exercised the rights the age gave him and disposed of her as he saw fit. The law, the custom, the whole weight of the social order stood behind him. She had nothing to set against it but pleas, and pleas were not enough. The reckoning stripped away the illusion of her power and showed her, and shows us, exactly how circumscribed the life of even the grandest woman of the age really was. And as for the Duke in all this, it is here, if anywhere, that the cold reading of him seems most justified. The picture of a man so detached that he could send his wife into exile and tear her from her children without apparent anguish, acting purely to protect his line and punish her offence. There is force in that reading, but even here, the ambiguity that surrounds him does not entirely lift, because we can also read his actions, if we are inclined to, as the response of a man who had been more wounded than he could show. He had tolerated the affair with Bess. He had tolerated, for years, a wife whose deepest love was elsewhere. He had absorbed a great deal with that famous composure. The affair with Grey and the child may have been the thing that finally reached him, the betrayal too far, the wound that even his armour could not turn aside. We cannot know whether he acted out of cold calculation or cold rage or the cold misery of a man hurt past expression. He gave, as always, no sign. But the very severity of his response, in a man who had borne so much else without protest, can be read as a measure of how much this particular blow had struck home. Whatever lay behind it, the sentence was passed, and Georgiana went. In the autumn of the affair's discovery, she left England, pregnant, disgraced, parted from her children, and from the man she loved, bound for the continent in a secret confinement, not knowing when or whether she would be allowed to come home. The exile that followed was the lowest passage of her life, a long grief-stricken wandering through unfamiliar cities in the shadow of her own ruin, and at the end of it lay the hardest thing she would ever have to do. We follow her now into that exile, and to the birth of the child she would not be allowed to keep. The exile took her across the continent, through France in the early convulsions of its revolution, and on into Italy and Switzerland, a long, restless, sorrowful journey through the cities of the continent in the company of a small party that included, as it almost always did, Bess. For all the tangle of their relations, Bess did not abandon Georgiana in her disgrace. She went with her into exile, shared the wandering and the waiting and the grief, and was at her side through the ordeal that lay at the end of it. Whatever Bess had taken from Georgiana over the years, in this she gave something back. The simple presence of a friend who would not leave when leaving would have been easy, and staying brought no advantage. The two women travelled together through the unusual interval of Georgiana's banishment, exiles of a kind, far from home, waiting for the thing that had to happen. The thing that had to happen was the birth, and it came in the early part of 1792 in France, far from England and from everyone who knew her. The child was a daughter. Georgiana named her Eliza, and the world would come to know her eventually as Eliza Courtenay. For a few days, perhaps a little longer, Georgiana had her newborn daughter with her, this child conceived in the one great passion of her life, and then she had to give her up. That was the bargain. That was the price of her eventual return to her other children. The baby could not come home. A child that was not the Duke's could not be brought into the Devonshire nursery, could not be acknowledged, could not exist as Georgiana's daughter in the eyes of the world. So the infant was taken from her and given over to be raised by Charles Grey's family, by his parents, who brought the little girl up as their own, as a late child of the household or a young relation, under one of the polite fictions that such situations required. Eliza would grow up not knowing for many years that the woman who occasionally visited, the great and famous Duchess of Devonshire, was in truth her mother. This was the deepest grief of Georgiana's life, and we should not pass over it quickly, because it is the wound that everything else in her story has been building toward. She had given up children before, in a sense. She had mothered other women's children and seen the lines of the household blurred in every direction. But this was her own child, her daughter, flesh of the one love that had been wholly hers, and she was made to surrender her and to go on living as though the child had never been. There was no grave to visit, no public loss to be consoled for, nothing she could even acknowledge. The grief had to be carried in silence, like the debts, like so much else, hidden behind the bright recovered surface of the Duchess who would in time come home and take up her life again. To lose a child to death is a sorrow others recognize and help to bear. To lose a living child into secrecy, to know that she breathed and grew somewhere else under another name, forbidden to you, was a sorrow Georgiana had to carry entirely alone, and she carried it for the rest of her life. Through the long months of the exile, her letters home are a continual ache, full of longing for her children, for England, for the life that had been taken from her, full of contrition and pleading, and the desperate hope of being allowed to return. She wrote to her mother, that constant confidant, pouring out the misery of her banishment. She wrote, where she could, in the effort to be restored. The exile was not only emotional, but in its way total. She had lost her standing, her home, her children, her lover, and her newborn daughter all at once. And she was left to piece together, out of letters and hopes, and the patient intercession of others, some path back to the life she had wrecked. It is a long way down from the summit of 1790, the triumphant Duchess with her son in her arms, to this, a disgraced and exiled woman giving up her baby on foreign soil and begging to be allowed to come home. And yet, even here, the resilience that ran through her whole character did not entirely fail. She did not break. She grieved, and she pleaded, and she endured, and she held on to the hope of return, and she kept, through it all, the capacity for love and attachment that was the deepest thing in her. Bess was with her. Her mother worked for her at home. Slowly, through the patient labour of the people who loved her, and the gradual cooling of the Duke's anger, a way back began to open. It would be a return on his terms, chastened, conditional, a restoration to a life permanently altered by what had happened. But it would be a return. The exile would end. She would see her children again. The cost had been the highest she would ever pay, a daughter given away into silence. But the rest of her life would be given back to her on sufferance by the man who held it in his hands. We turn now to the long, hard road home. The road home was not a single journey, but a long negotiation, conducted across distance and through intermediaries, and it depended above all on two women working patiently on Georgiana's behalf. One was her mother, Lady Spencer, who had been Georgiana's confidant and moral anchor since childhood, and who, whatever her private grief and disappointment at her daughter's conduct, never abandoned her. The other was Bess. It is one of the persistent strangenesses of this story that Bess, the woman who shared Georgiana's husband, was also among those who laboured to bring Georgiana back to him, interceding, smoothing, working to reconcile the Duke to his wife's return. Whether she did it out of love for Georgiana, or guilt, or the calculation that the household ran better whole, or some inextricable mixture of all three, the effect was the same. The two women who loved Georgiana most, the mother and the friend, worked together to soften the cold judgment of the man who held her fate. The Duke's anger cooled, as anger does, and self-interest pointed the same way as whatever softer feeling he may have had. A permanently exiled Duchess was its own kind of scandal and its own kind of inconvenience. The family functioned better with its celebrated centre restored to it. The children needed their mother. The appearances, always so important, were better served by reconciliation than by a wife left to wander the continent indefinitely. And so, by degrees, the terms of a return were settled. Georgiana would come home. The affair was over, absolutely and forever. She would not see Grey again in the old way, and the child would remain where she had been placed, unacknowledged, raised by others. Georgiana would resume her place as Duchess of Devonshire, take up again her life among her children and in society, and the whole episode would be sealed over in silence, never spoken of, folded into the long list of things the family did not discuss. She came home in 1793, after roughly 2 years away, and the reunion with her children was the thing she had crossed a continent of grief to reach. To hold little G and Harrio and Hart again, to be their mother again, to be restored to the daily life of love that was the truest part of her. This was what she had bargained everything for, and she had it back. Imagine that homecoming from the children's side, because it tells us what she had been to them and what her absence had cost. They had been small when she left, and she had been gone for the better part of 2 years, an eternity in the life of a young child, and they had been told some version of the truth that the family had agreed upon, that their mother was abroad for her health, that she would return when she was well. Now she came back to them, the mother who had been the warm centre of their lives and then had vanished, and the meeting must have held, under its joy, a strangeness, a wariness, the careful reapproach of children learning to trust again a love that had once, without explanation, been taken away. Hart had been an infant when the crisis broke. He scarcely remembered a time before his mother's absence. The two girls remembered and would have felt the alteration in her, the new shadow over the old brightness. For Georgiana, gathering them back to her, the happiness of it was real and enormous, and it was threaded through with the knowledge of the fourth child who could not be gathered, the daughter given away, the one of her children who would never run to meet her. She had her three. She had bought them back at the price of the fourth, and she held them, that day of her return, with the fierce attention of a woman who has learned exactly how easily everything she loves can be taken from her. But she came home changed, and to a life changed, and the change was permanent. She returned, chastened, diminished in her own standing within the marriage, more dependent than ever on her husband's goodwill, carrying the silent grief of the daughter she had surrendered and could never claim. The brilliant, reckless, unstoppable Georgiana of the 1780s did not come back from exile. What came back was an older, sadder, more careful woman who had learned exactly how circumscribed her life was, and exactly how completely her husband held the power in it, and who would never again test those limits as she had tested them with Grey. The marriage that reassembled itself after the exile was, in its way, more settled than the one that had been blown apart, because the terms were now clear to everyone. The Duke had demonstrated, beyond any further doubt, where the power lay and what the limits were. Georgiana had learned the lesson at the highest possible cost. Bess returned to her place in the household, and the triangle reconstituted itself, the three of them together again as before, but with the knowledge of the recent rupture underneath it, a shared understanding of how far things could go and what happened when they went too far. It was not a happy ending, it was a survival, a patching together of a life that had nearly come apart, a resumption on harder and clearer terms, but it held. The strange family closed over the wound and went on. There is something both moving and bleak in the spectacle of Georgiana's return. Moving, because she got back the children she loved and the home she had lost, and because the people who loved her had worked to restore her, and because she took up her broken life and made it whole again with the resilience that never quite deserted her. Bleak, because the price had been so high and the restoration so conditional, because she came home not in triumph but on sufferance, a forgiven offender rather than a free woman, and because the deepest grief of her life was now locked inside her permanently, a daughter given away, a love forbidden, a wound that could never be acknowledged or healed. She had reached the lowest point of her life in that exile, and she had climbed part way back, but she would never again stand where she had stood in 1790. The summit was behind her. What lay ahead was a longer, quieter, more shadowed country in which she would grow older among the people she loved, carrying what she carried until the end. And it is to that later country that we now go, to the years after the Great Crisis, when the household of three settled into its quiet autumn, and the bond between Georgiana and Bess, tested by everything, deepened into something that would last to the very end of Georgiana's life. For if there is a love story buried anywhere in all of this, it is perhaps not the one between the Duke and his Duchess at all, but the one between the two women who shared him. We turn now to the long settling and to what held the two of them together, after everything they had been through. The years after the exile were quieter, and in their quietness something began to show in the marriage that the loud early years had never revealed. The war was over. Georgiana had learned her limits, and would not break them again. The Duke had made his point, and had no further need to make it. And the two of them, with Bess at the third corner, settled into a long, worn, oddly companionable middle age together, The passion that had never been there between them was still not there. But passion was not the only thing a marriage could be made of, and in the absence of the fireworks, a different and more durable thing seems slowly to have grown, the thing that grows between two people who have lived many years in the same rooms and weathered the same storms and have in the end only each other to grow old beside. It is in this later period that the cold reading of the Duke begins, very gradually, to look incomplete. A man of pure indifference, having sent his erring wife into exile and brought her back chastened, might have treated her thereafter with the distant correctness of a creditor toward a debtor who has finally paid up. The Duke does not seem to have done this. The household reformed itself, the daily life resumed, and the marriage that emerged from the crisis was, by the small and indirect signs available to us, something more than a mere arrangement endured. They were, increasingly, a couple who had simply been together a very long time, who knew each other's habits and silences, who had buried children and weathered scandals and run up debts and reconciled, and who had arrived, through all of it, at a kind of mutual accommodation that, if it was not love in the way Georgiana had once dreamed of, was perhaps not so very far from a love of another kind. We have to be careful here, because the temptation, having spent so long on the coldness of the marriage, is to swing too far the other way and discover a hidden romance that the evidence does not support. The evidence is, as ever with the Duke, thin and ambiguous. He left no letters pouring out tenderness, because he left almost no letters pouring out anything. What we have are the indirect signs, the fact of his eventual grief, the things others noticed, the shape of a long partnership that did not, after the great rupture, fall apart, but instead grew calmly more settled. It is enough to make the simple story of a cold husband and a neglected wife feel too simple, without being enough to replace it with the opposite. The truth, as it almost always does with these two, sits in the difficult middle. The marriage was not a romance, but by its later years it may have become a marriage in the deeper sense, two people grown into each other's lives, past the point where either could be imagined without the other, and through these settling years the third presence remained. Bess was still there, still part of the household, still bound to both of them by the long, complicated history they all shared. The relations among the three of them had been tested to destruction, and had not in the end been destroyed. If anything, the bond between Georgiana and Bess deepened with age, the early passion of the friendship mellowing into the deep, settled attachment of two women who had been through everything together, who had shared a husband and a household and an exile and the secret griefs of both their lives, and who could not now imagine being parted. The two of them were, by this point, simply each other's, in a way that no scandal had managed to break. Whatever Bess had cost Georgiana, she had also been the steady companion of her whole adult life, present in the good years and the terrible ones, and that constancy counted for something real. So the picture of the household in its later years is not one of misery, but of a singular, weathered peace. Three people, no longer young, who had built an unconventional life and survived the near wreck of it, living out the long ordinary days together, the Duke at his cards and his routines, Georgiana among her children and her letters, Bess at the third corner of the triangle, the whole arrangement settled now into the deep grooves of long habit. The fireworks were over. The crisis was behind them. What remained was the quiet companionship of people who have spent their lives together and have, for all their differences and betrayals, become a kind of family that no longer questions its own strange shape. Before we follow the marriage to its hardest tests and its end, then, let us simply sit a while inside this settled later life, on one ordinary evening in the great house, and feel for ourselves what these three people had finally become to one another. Because the answer to the question we have been asking all this long while, the question of whether any love lived inside this unconventional arrangement, is written less in the great dramatic moments than in the quiet ones, in the texture of an ordinary night when nothing happened and the three of them simply sat together in the candlelight. Let us go into that room. Picture a winter evening at Chatsworth, the great house shut against the cold of the Derbyshire dark, the curtains drawn over the tall windows, the fires built high in the grates, the candles lit throughout the rooms that the family used. Outside, the moors are black and silent under the night. Inside, in one warm illuminated chamber, the three of them are gathered, as they have gathered on 10,000 such evenings, the Duke and the Duchess, and the friend who has shared their whole adult lives. The Duke sits at the card table, as he almost always sits, the candlelight catching the cards in his hand, and the heavy, composed, unreadable planes of his face. He is older now, settled deeper into the habits that have always defined him, and there is something almost restful in his constancy, the same man in the same chair at the same hour, asking nothing, disturbing nothing, the fixed point around which the household has always turned. One of his dogs lies at his feet, as a dog has always lain at his feet, and now and then his hand drops to rest on its head without his seeming to notice that it does. He says little. He has never said much. But he is there, fully and solidly there, and after all the years his mere presence has become a kind of speech, the statement of a man who stays, who does not leave, who is always in his chair when the evening comes. Georgiana is at her writing, the endless correspondence that has poured from her all her life, the letters to her mother and her sister, and the wide circle of women who love her, her pen moving across the paper in the candlelight. Her face is altered now, marked by the illness that took her beauty, the sight gone from one eye, and she has learned to carry the alteration with a grace that has become, in its way, more affecting than the beauty ever was. She writes, and she talks as she writes, the warm, easy current of her conversation filling the room as it has always filled every room she has ever been in, drawing the others into the small commerce of the evening, the remarks about the day, the news from London, the doings of the children. The hunger that drove her so hard in the wild years has quieted. She has at last something like peace, here in the candlelit room with the two people who have been the constants of her life. And Bess is there, at the third corner, where she has been for more than 20 years, her needlework in her lap or her book in her hand, woven so deeply now into the fabric of the household that it is impossible to imagine it without her. The passions and the jealousies and the secret griefs that ran beneath this arrangement in its earlier years have not vanished, but they have mellowed, settled, been absorbed into the long, deep habit of a life shared past the point of any possible separation. The two women who once wrote to each other in the language of lovers, who shared a husband and an exile and the hidden sorrows of both their lives, are now simply old companions, each knowing the other to the bone, comfortable in the silence between remarks in the way that only people who have spent decades together can be. Whatever this thing is that the three of them have built, it is by now unquestionably a family, and a family at rest. There is no need for them to talk much on an evening like this. The great dramas are behind them. The crowds and the elections and the scandals, the affair and the exile and the lost child, the births and the griefs and the reconciliations, all of it has happened. All of it is woven now into the long shared past that lies beneath the quiet of the room. What remains is the ordinary precious texture of a life lived together, The cards and the letters and the needlework, the fire and the candles and the dog on the hearth, the small remarks, the comfortable silences, the deep unspoken knowledge that these three people have of one another after so many years. It is not the life that any of them would have designed. It is the life they made between them out of what they were given and what they wanted and what they could not help, and against every expectation it has become a home. Hold that room in your mind for a moment, the fire-lit chamber against the winter dark, the three weathered figures in their accustomed places, the whole turbulent history of their lives gathered now into this stillness. It is as close to happiness as their odd arrangement ever came, this late, settled, companionable peace. And it could not last, because nothing lasts, and because Georgiana's body, worn by all it had carried, was beginning to fail her earlier than her years should have allowed. The evenings like this one were numbered, though none of the three of them knew the number. We turn now, as we must, toward the ending, and toward the illness that would before too long empty one of the chairs in that warm room forever. The illness came in 1796, and it was savage. It began as an infection of the eye, and became something that swept through her whole system, a violent and dangerous sickness that brought her, for a time, close to death. The treatments of the age were as brutal as the disease, the doctors applying their leeches and their caustics and their desperate remedies to an eye and a face already in agony, and then for weeks Georgiana lay in real danger of her life. She survived. But survival came at a cost written permanently on the one thing the world had always prized her for. Her face was disfigured. The infected eye was ruined, its sight lost, the whole side of her face altered and scarred by the violence of the illness and its treatment. The most beautiful woman in England, the face on 1,000 prints, the standard of fashion that other women had spent 20 years trying to copy, was beautiful no longer. It is difficult, in an age that prizes appearance as much as our own does, to grasp fully what this meant for a woman whose entire public identity had been bound up with her looks. Georgiana had been famous in large part for being beautiful. Her face had been her instrument and her fortune, the thing that drew every eye, that made the crowds gather, that turned a clever and warm young woman into a national celebrity. To lose it, and to lose it not gradually to age but suddenly and violently to disease, in her late 30s, was to lose a great part of the self she had presented to the world for 2 decades. The famous Duchess could no longer be looked at in the old way. The thing that had defined her in the public eye was gone. And here we see something fine in her, something that the years of trouble had deepened rather than destroyed. Georgiana met the ruin of her beauty with a composure and a wry courage that surprised those who had taken her for nothing more than a vain society beauty. She did not retreat from society. She did not hide her altered face away. She went on, appeared in society, kept her place at the centre of her circle, carried her disfigurement with a grace that won her a different and perhaps deeper kind of admiration than her beauty ever had. There is a quality of inner substance revealed in this, the substance that had always been there underneath the glitter, the warmth and the resilience and the refusal to be defeated, now thrown into relief by the loss of the surface that had distracted everyone from it. Stripped of the beauty that had made her famous, Georgiana turned out to be made of more durable stuff than her reputation had ever suggested. The loss also shifted something in her relations with the people closest to her, and it is here that the question of the Duke returns with a new sharpness. A man who had married a woman for her suitability and her splendour and her capacity to do credit to his name, a cold man, An unfeeling man, the man of the harshest readings, might well have found his interest in a disfigured wife diminished, might have turned away, might have let the loss of her beauty become one more distance between them. There is no sign that the Duke did any such thing. The marriage went on as before, the household intact, the disfigured Duchess still its centre, still her husband's wife in every outward way. If the loss of her beauty cooled him toward her, no one recorded it. The arrangement that had survived the affair, and the exile survived the illness too, and Georgiana, scarred and half-blind, remained the Duchess of Devonshire, in her place, among her family, for the rest of her days. We should not make too much of this, in either direction. It would be sentimental to read the Duke's continued acceptance of his altered wife as a grand declaration of love beneath the surface. He may simply have been a man of fixed habits, to whom the disfigurement of his wife made no practical difference, the marriage being long since settled into something quite apart from her appearance. But it would be equally one-sided to ignore it. Whatever else can be said about him, the Duke did not abandon or coldly distance himself from Georgiana when she lost the beauty that had been, in the marriage market that made them, a chief part of her value. He kept her, the household held, and in a man so given to revealing nothing, the simple fact of constancy, the not turning away, may be as close to a statement of feeling as he was ever capable of making. For Georgiana, the loss of her beauty was, in a strange way, a kind of liberation, as well as a grief, freed at last from the role of the great beauty, from the relentless being looked at that had defined her since she was 17, she could be, more simply. The later years of her life have a quality of greater depth and seriousness than the dazzling early ones, as though the woman underneath had finally been allowed to come forward, now that the famous face no longer stood in front of her. She turned more to her family, to her children growing toward adulthood, to her sister, to her mother, to the deep attachments that had always meant more to her than the applause of crowds. And it is to those attachments, the family ties that sustained her through the long autumn of her life, that we turn next, beginning with the sister who had walked beside her through so much of it. Georgiana had a sister, and the bond between them was one of the great sustaining relationships of her life, less complicated than her marriage, less fraught than her friendship with Bess, a deep and steady current running underneath everything else. Her name was Henrietta, called Harriet, 4 years younger than Georgiana, and she had married, as her sister had, into the high aristocracy, becoming in time Countess of Bessborough. The two Spencer sisters had grown up together in the warm affection of their childhood home, and they remained all their lives the closest of confidants, bound by a love and an understanding that nothing ever shook. To read their correspondence is to overhear two women who knew each other to the bone, who could say to one another what they could say to no one else, who had been each other's witnesses since the nursery. Their lives had run in unsettling parallel. Harriet, too, had married into a great family and an unhappy match. Her husband was difficult, the marriage cold in its own way, and she knew, as Georgiana knew, what it was to be a brilliant and feeling woman bound for life to a man who could not meet her. Harriet, too, had her loves outside her marriage, her own attachments and entanglements and the heartbreaks that came with them. Harriet, too, knew the particular trials of a great lady in that position, the gambling, the debts, the impossible position of women who had everything except power over their own lives. The sisters understood each other so completely because they were living in different houses, versions of the same constrained and dazzling and sorrowful existence. Each was the other's refuge. The one person who needed nothing explained. Nowhere was that refuge more vital than in the years of Georgiana's disgrace. When the catastrophe broke and Georgiana was sent abroad, it was Harriet who, for part of that long exile, went with her, sharing the wandering and the waiting and the grief, the slow, uncertain hope of return. Harriet had troubles enough of her own in those years, her own health uncertain, her own marriage a burden, her own heart entangled in difficulties that paralleled her sister's with an almost eerie closeness. And yet the two of them, in their shared banishment, were a comfort to each other that no one else could have supplied. Two sisters far from home, each carrying secrets she could confess to no one but the other, holding each other up through the worst passage of both their lives. To picture them in some rented set of rooms in a foreign town, two daughters of one of England's grandest families reduced to exile and concealment, talking through the long evenings of the children they missed, and the loves that had ruined them, and the home they longed to see again, is to understand what the bond between them truly was. It was the one relationship in Georgiana's life that asked nothing of her, and gave without condition, the one love that never once, in all her years, turned to a source of pain. Whatever else the world took from her, it never took her sister. There is a tenderness in the way the sisters cared for each other through their respective troubles that stands in quiet contrast to the colder relations that surrounded them. When Georgiana was in disgrace and exile, Harriet was among those who grieved for her and worked for her return. When Harriet was in difficulty, Georgiana was there. They shared their children, their worries, their secrets. In a life where so many of Georgiana's attachments were shadowed by complication, the affair with its lost child, the friendship with Bess tangled up with her husband, the marriage that never warmed, the bond with her sister was something clean and uncomplicated and reliable. A love with no hidden cost, no betrayal folded inside it, no power held over her. Harriet asked nothing of Georgiana but her love, and gave nothing but the same, and through all the chaos of both their lives, that simple exchange never failed. The sisters were part of a wider web of Spencer women and Devonshire connections, an interlocking world of mothers and daughters and cousins and friends, through whom the real emotional business of these families was largely conducted. For all that the age was ruled by men, who held the property and the titles and the legal power, the inner life of these great households often ran through their women, through the letters and the visits and the confidences that bound them together. Georgiana sat at the centre of one of the densest of these webs, connected by love and blood and long friendship to a circle of women who sustained one another through the trials that their marriages and their station imposed. Her sister was the closest of these connections, but she was one of many, and the picture of Georgiana that emerges from this side of her life is not the lonely, neglected wife of the early chapters, but a woman richly embedded in a network of female love and loyalty that gave her, outside her marriage, much of the affection her marriage withheld. It is worth holding this picture alongside the story of the cold marriage, because it corrects the impression that Georgiana's emotional life was simply starved. It was not starved. It was, in fact, abundant. Only abundant in the wrong places by the reckoning of her age, which expected a woman's deepest bonds to be with her husband, and gave little value to the loves that ran elsewhere. Georgiana's deepest bonds ran almost everywhere except to her husband, to her sister, to her mother, to Bess, to her children, to the wide circle of women who loved her. She had an enormous capacity for love, and she found, despite everything, enormous quantities of it to give and receive. The tragedy of her marriage was real, but it was the tragedy of one relationship in a life otherwise full of them. And to see her whole, we have to see the richness as well as the lack. At the center of that web of love, from the very beginning to the very end, stood one figure above all others, the person to whom Georgiana confided more than to anyone, the moral anchor of her whole existence, the one she wrote to in her triumphs and her disgraces alike, whose love she never doubted and whose disappointment she most feared, her mother. Through the whole long story we have been telling, from the warm childhood at Althorpe to the deathbed that is now not far off, Lady Spencer was there, loving and judging and never letting go. We turn now to that lifelong bond between mother and daughter, the longest and in some ways the most important relationship of Georgiana's life. If there was one constant in Georgiana's life, one thread that ran unbroken from her cradle to within a year of her grave, it was her mother. Margaret Georgiana, Countess Spencer, had borne her, raised her, married her off, and then spent the next 30 years as the great correspondent and counsellor and conscience of her daughter's existence. The two of them wrote to each other ceaselessly, and the letters that survive are among the richest records we have of Georgiana's inner life, because to her mother she told things she told no one else, poured out her hopes and her fears and her follies and her griefs over decades in a flood of confidence that never entirely stopped, even in the periods when mother and daughter were at odds. Lady Spencer was not a simple or an easy mother. She loved Georgiana fiercely, but she loved her with a love that came braided through with anxiety and judgment, and the constant urge to correct. She had ambitions for her daughter, moral as well as social, and she watched Georgiana's career with a mixture of pride and alarm that often tipped over into reproach. She disapproved of the gambling and warned against it for years before it ruined her daughter. She disapproved of the fast society and the recklessness and the entanglements. When Georgiana fell into disgrace over Grey, her mother's grief and disappointment were profound, and the relationship between them passed through real strain. And yet Lady Spencer never abandoned her. Through every folly and every catastrophe she went on loving, went on writing, went on working for her daughter's good, as she understood it, and when the gravest crisis came it was her mother, more than anyone, who laboured to bring Georgiana home. The shaping had begun very early, long before any of the troubles, in the warm and watchful household of Georgiana's childhood. Lady Spencer had raised her daughter with deep love and great expectation in roughly equal measure, lavishing affection on the bright, charming, eager girl, while also impressing on her, from the start, the duties and the dangers of the position she would one day fill. There is a famous letter written by the mother to the daughter around the time of the marriage, full of grave and tender counsel about how a great lady ought to conduct herself, the temptations she must resist, the dignity she must maintain, the pitfalls of the glittering world she was entering. It was the distilled wisdom of an older woman who knew exactly how treacherous that life could be for a young one, and it was offered out of real love. The tragedy is that almost every danger the mother warned against, the daughter would in time fall into. The gambling, the recklessness, the entanglements of the heart, the loss of dignity before a watching world, all of it came to pass, despite the warnings, perhaps in part because the very qualities that made Georgiana so lovable, the warmth, the impulsiveness, the hunger for affection, were precisely the qualities that left her defenceless against the world's temptations. Her mother had seen it coming and had not been able to prevent it, and there is a special sorrow in that, the sorrow of a parent who watches a beloved child walk, despite every warning, straight into the troubles she foresaw. The relationship between them carried, in concentrated form, the same tension that ran through Georgiana's whole life, the tension between the love she needed and the judgment she could not escape. Her mother loved her, but her mother's love came with conditions, with expectations, with a steady undertone of "you could do better, you must do better," that Georgiana spent her life trying to satisfy and never quite could. In a sense, the tenderness and the disapproval she met in her mother prefigured the warmth and the coldness she would meet in the rest of her life, the love freely given and the standards relentlessly applied. Georgiana worshipped her mother and feared her judgment in almost equal measure, and the effort to be worthy of her, to win the unqualified approval that always seemed just out of reach, was one of the deep drivers of her character. But beneath the friction, the love was absolute on both sides, and it is the love that lasted. Lady Spencer was the one person who had known Georgiana before she was famous, before she was a duchess, before fame made her into the public figure that everyone else responded to. To her mother, she was always underneath the title and the celebrity, simply Georgiana, the daughter, the same girl who had grown up at Althorpe in the warmth of a loving family. That continuity mattered enormously to a woman whose whole adult existence had been a performance for a watching world. With her mother, she could, at least sometimes, stop performing. She could be the child again, loved and scolded and held in the one relationship that long predated and would long outlast all the others. There is something fitting and something sad in the fact that the longest and steadiest love of Georgiana's life was the one she was born into rather than any she chose. The marriage that should have been the centre of her emotional life was a cold and difficult thing. The friendship that filled the gap was tangled past unravelling with that same marriage. The one great passion she allowed herself ended in catastrophe and a lost child. But her mother was there from the beginning, constant through everything, and would be there in fact at the very end, an old woman by then, outliving the daughter she had spent her life loving and worrying over. The natural order would be broken, the mother would bury the child, but that is to run ahead, to the ending we have been circling for some time, and must now, at last, approach. For Georgiana was growing old before her time. The illnesses, the strains, the years of secret debt and secret grief, the violent sickness that had taken her beauty, all of it had worn her down, and as the new century opened, she was not the woman she had been. The body that had borne so much, the constitution that had survived so many shocks, was failing earlier than its years would have predicted. The long autumn of her life was shortening toward winter. She was still the centre of her circle, still loved, still surrounded by the family and friends who had gathered around her through all the years. But her health was going, and those who loved her had begun, without quite saying so, to watch her with the particular tenderness that people reserve for someone they are afraid of losing. We turn now to the last years, and to the gentle, sorrowful approach of the end. The last years of Georgiana's life had a mellowed, valedictory quality, the quality of an evening drawing in. She was no longer young, no longer beautiful, no longer the dazzling phenomenon of the 1780s, and she had made, by all appearances, a kind of peace with that. The reckless hungers of her youth had largely burned themselves out, leaving behind a woman of more substance and more repose, still warm, still loved, still the heart of her circle, but quieter now, more inward, more given to the deep family attachments that had always mattered to her most. The house was still full of people. The Whig world still revolved to a degree around Devonshire House, but the centre of Georgiana's own life had moved. in these final years, from the public stage to the private hearth, from the crowds to the children and the few beloved faces that remained. Her children were growing up, and watching them grow was one of the chief joys and occupations of her last years. Little G and Harry-O were becoming women, moving toward marriages of their own, and Georgiana threw herself into their futures with all her old maternal devotion, anxious for their happiness, deeply involved in their lives. She lived to see little G, the elder, settled in a marriage of her own into another of the great families of the kingdom, a quiet satisfaction to a mother who knew better than most how completely a marriage could shape the whole of a woman's life, and who wanted for her daughters something more than the bare suitability that had been thought sufficient for her. For Harry-O, the younger and sharper of the two, the right match was still being weighed in these last years, and Georgiana gave to the question of her daughter's future all the anxious, loving attention she had once been unable to spare for her own. Her son Hart, the precious heir, was growing toward the man who would one day inherit everything, and her love for him had in it, perhaps, a special tenderness, the child who had secured her place, the answer to all those years of anxious waiting. She had, in these children, the great compensation of her life, the love that had always run cleanest and surest, and she gathered them close as the end approached, taking, in the ordinary business of a mother among her grown and growing children, the deepest contentment she had known. The household of 3 endured to the last. Bess was still there, still bound to Georgiana by the long, indissoluble history of their lives together, the two of them grown old in each other's company as they had grown up in it. The Duke was still there, still at his cards and his routines, still unreadable, but present, the steady, fixed point he had always been. Whatever the unusual architecture of that household, whatever the betrayals and accommodations folded into its long history, the 3 of them had become, by the end, simply a family, an old and weathered and unconventional family that had outlasted every prediction of its collapse. They had built something together, these 3, against every rule of how such things were supposed to go, and it had held. It held to the end. But the debts followed her even into these last years, never quite cleared. A shadow that never entirely lifted, the one trouble of her life that she never managed to escape. She owed money to the last, the old habit and its consequences trailing her down the years, a private weight she carried even as her health failed. There is something poignant in the persistence of it, this woman who had everything by the measure of the world, dying still entangled in obligations she could not meet, the secret strain of it never fully laid down. The debts were of a kind with everything else in her. The appetite that could not be governed, the reaching for more than her life allowed, the warmth and the recklessness so deeply mixed in her that one could not be had without the other. She had lived large, and loved large, and spent large, and the bill, in more senses than the financial one, was never quite settled. As the new century moved into its first years, her health declined in earnest. The constitution that had survived so many shocks was wearing out. She suffered, increasingly, from the illnesses that would carry her off, the body failing while she was still, by the calendar, far from old. Those around her saw it. Her mother, her sister, her children, and Bess drew in around her, the whole web of people who had carried her through every earlier trouble now gathering for the one trouble none of them could mend. The particular watchfulness of people who fear a loss settled over the household. Georgiana herself, who had faced down disgrace and exile, and the ruin of her beauty with such resilience, faced this too with the courage that had always been the bedrock under her brilliance, gathering her family, holding to her loves, living what was left of her life among the people who mattered to her. She had perhaps a sense of what was coming. The letters and the recollections of these last years carry a tenderness, a drawing together, a quality of farewell not yet spoken. She was not yet 50. By the natural reckoning, she should have had decades still before her, should have lived to see her grandchildren, to grow into the grand old Duchess presiding over a family dynasty. She would not. The years of strain had taken their toll, and the end, when it came, would come early in the spring of 1806, in the great house in Piccadilly, where she had begun her married life as a girl of 17. We come now to that ending, and to the question that has hung over this whole story from the first words, the question we set out to answer and have circled all this long evening. It is the question of what the silent man she had married felt when the woman everyone adored lay dying. We turn at last to the end and to the answer. Adnaldo date. The end came at Devonshire House in the spring of 1806, in the same great rooms behind the high wall in Piccadilly, where she had begun her married life 32 years before, as a girl of 17. She was 48 years old. The illness that took her was an affliction of the liver, an internal sickness that had been building in her for some time, and against which the medicine of the age could do nothing but ease, a little, the suffering of her last days. She had borne so much in her life, and she bore this too, with the people she loved gathered close around her in the rooms where it had all begun. On the 30th of March, 1806, Georgiana Cavendish, Duchess of Devonshire, died. They were all there, or near, the people of her strange and crowded life. Her children, whom she had loved more purely than she had loved anything. Her mother, the old Countess, who would now do the thing no mother should have to do, and outlive her child. Her sister Harriet, the lifelong confidante. And Bess, of course, Bess who had shared her husband and her household, and her exile, and the secret griefs of more than 20 years present at the end, as she had been present through so much of the middle. The household of three was breaking, after all its long endurance, in the only way such a thing could be broken, by death. And the third figure, the silent one, the husband who had stood at the unreadable centre of it all, was there too. And it is here, at the very last, that we get our answer, or as much of an answer as this most closed of men ever gave to anyone. Because the Duke of Devonshire, who had spent 32 years giving nothing away, who had met every event of his married life, the triumphs and the betrayals and the scandals and the reconciliations, with the same heavy composure, who had never, so far as anyone could tell, allowed his feeling for his wife to show itself in any word or gesture that the world could read, broke at her death. The man of glass, the closed room, the husband whose love, if it existed at all, had always been locked away past anyone's reach, was undone by her dying. Those around him were struck by the depth of his grief, struck precisely because it was so unlike him, because here at last was feeling in a man they had taken to have little, the buried thing surfacing now that it was too late to be of any use to her. He had loved her. That, in the end, seems to be the truth of it. He had loved her all along, in his sealed and silent way, with a love he could not speak and perhaps could not even fully own, and only her death could draw it out of him. So we return, at the very last, to the question we began with, the question of whether it was a love story. After this whole long evening of asking, the honest answer is that it was, but not the kind that either of them, or we, would first have imagined. It was not a romance. It had no passion in it, no ardour, None of the loud and hungry love that Georgiana had craved her whole life and gone looking for everywhere but at home. It was something stranger and in its way more affecting. The slow, accidental growing together of two mismatched people across 3 decades of a shared life, until the cold man who could not say he loved his wife discovered, when he lost her, that he could not bear to be without her. The tragedy of it is that the discovery came too late to do her any good, that she lived and died never quite certain of the thing that her death finally revealed. She had spent 32 years reading an unreadable face for a love she was never sure was there. And it had been there. She simply never got to know. The story did not end with her death, though the heart of it did. She was carried north in the end and buried among the Cavendishes at Derby, laid to rest with the family she had joined as a girl of 17 and belonged to, for better and worse, ever after. The Duke, the grieving widower, did in time the thing that completed the singular logic of the triangle. 3 years after Georgiana died, he married Bess. The friend who had shared the marriage in life became the wife in name at last, the third corner of the triangle moving at last into the empty place at its centre. It scandalized some and surprised no one who had understood the household, and it gave Bess, after a lifetime of getting almost everything by patience and proximity, the final thing she had perhaps always wanted. The Duke himself did not long survive his first wife. He died in 1811, 5 years after Georgiana, and the mismatched marriage that had begun on a girl's 17th birthday in 1774 was, with his death, finally and wholly over, both its principles gone, the question it had posed answered as fully as it would ever be. And so we leave them, the warm woman and the silent man, the most loved creature in England, and the most closed, who were bound together by their families when she was 17, and who grew against every expectation and entirely without meaning too, into something that one of them at least could not survive the loss of. Let your mind rest there for a moment, in the candlelit rooms of that great vanished house, with all its loves and secrets and the strange weathered family it held. The crowds that adored her are long since dust. The prints of her famous face are curiosities now. But the thing underneath, the simple human truth of two people who lived a long life side by side and found too late that they had come to belong to each other, that is not so far from us, and not so hard to understand, and it is a tender thing to carry with you down into sleep. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever the hour has become while we have sat together with these long-ago lives, thank you for spending this evening here. If these journeys into the past are something you would like more of, you are always welcome to subscribe, so the next one finds its way to you when it comes. Until then, rest easy. And now let the great house grow quiet. Let the candles burn down. Let the warm woman and the silent man go to their long rest, and let yourself follow them down into yours. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.